Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the DOT Endangered Species Act consultation process webinar series. Today we are at webinar series number 3 and starting off March 1st on a good note. So today we will be talking about some different online resources. Both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries will be sharing some of the resources that they have, as well as some of the DOT resources that we have as well. We'll be going through some practical examples that we have, and we have some really great guest speakers here with us today as well to go through some species-specific highlights. So just as a quick reminder for the overall webinar series, we do have one more session coming up. Kendra, if you don't mind changing slides for me, thank you. One more session coming up on March 8th, next Tuesday. We'll wrap us up. So if you haven't yet registered, make sure you go ahead and register for that session as well. And just as a quick reminder, this series is kind of set up for folks that maybe have a little bit of NEPA experience already, or endangered species consultation or permitting experience. So if any of this information is unfamiliar or you need a little bit more background, we have a lot of other resources available, and you can certainly reach out to us to get some more details if you need those. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kendra for a brief reminder on how to participate in our webinar today.
Thank you, Katasha, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third webinar of our 4-part series. My name is Kendra Putris, and I'll be assisting our presenters today with the online event. Please submit your questions and comments through the question pane at any time throughout the presentation. We will pause a couple of times throughout the presentation to answer those questions, and again at the end of the webinar. There are handouts available for you to download from the system platform, and just a reminder that today's session is being recorded. We'll now turn it back over to Katasha Cornwell to kick off today's Practical Examples and Species-Specific Highlights webinar.
Thanks, Kendra. So we're going to welcome back several of our speakers that we've been hearing over this series. So Mark Cantrell is with us again from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Dr. Dave Rydeen is back with us from NOAA Fisheries, as well as Curtis Gregg from NOAA Fisheries. And we also have a new guest speaker with us today, Ruth Roaza. She's with the DOT Office of Environmental Management. Ruth is an environmental process analyst with OEM. She has over 30 years of experience providing information technology solutions for environmental management, primarily supporting NEPA studies and transportation project delivery. Prior to joining DOT, Ruth was a senior project manager for AECOM's Florida Transportation Business Line. In that capacity, Ruth supported DOT with PD&E studies and in the development and implementation of the efficient transportation decision-making process. She led the team of programmers who developed DOT's environmental screening tool, which we're going to be talking about today, as well as the statewide environmental project tracker. All of those systems are really, really critical to what we do here at DOT. Her previous experience includes IT and GIS program administrator at DEP, and scientific programmer for water quality programs at DEP and USGS. Ruth has a bachelor's degree from Muskingum University with a double major in religion/philosophy and computer science. Her master's work was in cross-cultural communication at Ohio University, following a year working with the Inupiaq, I think I got that right, in Utqiagvik, Alaska. So Ruth has some really great stories about her time there with those natives. So it's pretty cool work that she's done. And we really appreciate Ruth being here with us today to talk about the really important resources that we do have here at DOT that relate to endangered species. So with that, we'll also introduce briefly our guest speakers who will be giving our species-specific presentations. I'm pleased to introduce Victoria Garcia. Vicki is a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist with the service in the Vero Beach office. She's been working there for a little over a year. She works on Everglades restoration for the SERP the SERP North team, and is the snail kite recovery lead for the service. Much of Vicki's work involves interagency coordination and providing technical assistance to avoid impacts to snail kites. She also coordinates with other agencies to avoid negative impacts to resources during all phases of Everglades restoration projects in the Northern Everglades. Vicki is also the Lake Okeechobee Regional Coordinator for Recover, which is the scientific and technical review team for the Everglades restoration. And super excited to have Vicki here with us today. I really personally love seeing snail kites, and have appreciated seeing their kind of northern expansion of their range up into the Gainesville area. So really interested to hear her talk today. We also have Calusa Horn here with us from NOAA Fisheries. Calusa is an endangered species biologist with over a decade of experience in the management, conservation, and recovery of threatened and endangered species. She has worked with the Endangered Species Act Section 4, which is the species petitions, reviews, and listings process. She's worked in Section 6, which is the Species Recovery Grant Program, as well as Section 7, which is what we've been talking about in this webinar series. She's currently the lead for the Southeast Region Giant Manta Ray Recovery Efforts in the Section 6 Species Recovery Grant Program and the Tribal Liaison for the Southeast Region. And again, super excited to have Calusa with us here today. I remember specifically loving those touch tanks at SeaWorld with the ray, so really interested to hear specifically about the giant manta ray today. We have Luke Davis with us today from the Fish and Wildlife Service. He has a BS in Environmental Science and Policy from FSU. He worked he has worked, with the Fish and Wildlife Service in the Jacksonville office since 2020. Previously, Luke worked for FWC for 15 years in the Tallahassee office, coordinating biological opinions for regulatory permits related to manatees and marine turtles. He also managed the Marine Turtle Lighting Certification Program and coordinated with local governments, federal partners, DOT, and other state agencies on issues related to marine turtle lighting. And again, Luke was a great partner for DOT when he worked at FWC. He helped us develop some really good marine or lighting turtle guidance documents. And so we appreciate Luke being back here with us again today in this capacity. And then last but not least, Dr. Dave Rydeen is back with us one more time to talk about sea turtles as well from the NOAA fisheries side. So with that, we'll just give you guys just a brief glimpse again at each of the speakers, what they're going to be covering today. Again, Curtis will kick us off with some online resource discussion, and then we'll kind of go from there to talk through those online resources from each of the agencies, then get into some project-specific examples. We'll have some time for Q&A, and then we'll dive into our species-specific talks as well, with plenty of time for Q&A with those folks also. So with that, Curtis, if you want to go ahead and get us started, that'd be great.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Katasha, for that introduction. I wanted to go through some online resources that are available regarding Endangered Species Act Section 7 consultations. And I'm going to be talking specifically about the ESA Section 7 mapper tool. It's brand new, it's still in beta testing, but our colleagues at the Protected Resources Division have shared it outside of our agency. And if anyone on the call wants to try it, it's the second link on the FDOT ESA training, NMFS, and US Fish and Wildlife Service online resources handout. So when you open the ESA Section 7 mapper main page, you get this welcome to the page and some background information. You can click OK in the lower right, and that'll close that dialog box. And then there's additional information and the more information on the right side that you see here. And I usually close that to get into the tool. So after you close the two dialog boxes, you get the Southeast region of the National Marine Fisheries Service overview. You can see a little red oval on the hamburger menu in the upper left. Next slide. Kendra, next slide. Oh, sorry, I missed it. Back one, there we go. When you open that hamburger menu, all of the layers are on. You can see the blue boxes on the left side checked. I like to turn that off, and that allows zooming into a project area more quickly. And what I've done here is zoomed into the Long Key Bridge. It's a replacement project that recently went through the Early Transportation Decision Making and Environmental Screening Tool review in FDOT District 6. So we're going to use this project as an example today. What I like to do is use the measure tool, which you see in the red oval in the upper left, to just outline the project work area. This is not the entire project area, but it is, basically the location of the bridge and the Inwater work. Using the hamburger menu, you can turn on all of the layers again, and then and that's at the red oval in the upper left. Once they're on, you can see where the green arrow is. You just click a point in the project area, and it'll return all of the records of Endangered Species Act, listed species, designated critical habitat, and things like that, the different life history stages. And you can see that the ESA mapper tool returned 51 records that you can see in the black oval, kind of in the center of the screen. And then where the red arrow is, there's a small arrow on that blue bar that you can use to advance through those 51 records, one record at a time, to see all of the species that were returned, the life history stages, the habitat usages, and that's the information on that little box. Alternatively, you can again turn off all of the layers on the hamburger menu and toggle, and then click on one group of species at a time. In this case, I clicked on the corals, and you can see in the black oval in the middle, it returned 24 records for ESA listed corals, which includes different life history stages. There's not 24 listed corals, there's 7, but we've got different life history stages and habitats. And again, at the red arrow, you can advance through those records to see all of that information. One thing you'll notice when you toggle through the records is sometimes the blue outline that you see around the shoreline, that'll change as you move through the records, and that's because each layer, each record represents a different report. So on the left, on the toggle, you can see the grouper and sturgeon box is clicked, and then clicking in the project area, you can see that 2 records were returned for grouper and sturgeon, and they're both Nassau grouper records for this project area. So Nassau grouper is a recently listed species, so I kind of wanted to highlight that one for you. And then there's another tool on the ESA Section 7 mapper that I find very helpful. And you see the red oval in the upper left that's over the draw your action area. And that gives you 4 options to review records. And so what I've done in this example is use the line option that you can see at the blue arrow to draw the action area around the bridge. And you can see that there's a buffer that the system uses to return records. And the default distance is 1 mile, but I wanted to see how far down in resolution I could go. So I went to 1/10 of a mile, and you can see that buffer on the figure in the middle of the screen surrounding the dashed line. And then you click on preview results. And this sorting takes quite a while. The draw your action area analysis takes a lot longer than running just a clicking a point on the map, but it ensures inclusion of all the relevant ESA species records. And you could include, perhaps the transit areas for barges. You could include other parts that are part of the project area that might not be where the work is occurring, and include that in the analysis for ESA listed species. And you can see in the red rectangle in the results that it returned 24 coral results, no seagrass results, because it's Johnson seagrass, and that's not a species that is in the Keys. Then you got 25 sea turtle results, 12 sharks and rays and sawfish, the 2 grouper results, no whales. And then you can use the slider bar that's there near the green arrow to scroll down and see that there were 4 designated critical habitat records. And also at the green area, just to the left of that slider is a little gear, and you can click on that gear and it'll bring up the 24 coral records in this example. So clicking that gear brings up the dialog boxes with each of those records, and you use that little arrow to click through. So this is just a demonstration to offer you the opportunity to get into the ESA Section 7 mapper and try it for yourself. And if you have feedback that you want to provide, our colleagues in the Protected Resources Division have a Google document that we can input that information to. And if there's something else you want to see on the tool or a different functionality, we may be able to get some information on that. So that's all I've got for this portion of the presentation. So up next is Mark Cantrell. Mark, take it away.
Thank you, Curtis. Yes, my name is Mark Cantrell, and I want to highlight a couple of online resources that we have from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And just like Curtis examined that Section 7 mapper, there's a lot of great stuff on the interwebs. Next. So before we throw you into the deep end, we've got a lot of self-help information there. You can dig into that at any time of the day or night. We are living in the information age, and there's a lot of information out there, and some of it is good. So that's the reminder that on the next slide, I want to highlight things from the Fish and Wildlife Service webpage that you can drill into. And with that, I would add that it's a good idea, especially for endangered species information, to rely on information from official government web pages, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NMFS, from our state agencies, from our partners there. A great source of good information. From the Fish and Wildlife Service web page, we can drill into the Endangered Species web page. There's a link there on the front of the FWS online footprint. You'll find endangered species information where you can search on the species name or an area, particular county level, and that will tell you what might be in the area of your project or area of interest. And next, similar to the Section 7 mapper, IPAC, as we call it, the information for planning and consultation. Fish and Wildlife Service worked really hard on putting this information out there specifically to help with the environmental review process. No matter what your project, IPAC is a really powerful online tool. And in the handout that Curtis and I put together, you'll find that in the files section. That little handout will get you started. There should be a link to that in the handout. So take a look at that. IPAC on the next page can take you to a number of resources, again, where you can explore the species and the habitat, links back to the individual species. You can do a regulatory review. You can log in, actually create a login page for yourself and look at a project or multiple projects, come back to those projects. But similar to the Section 7 mapper, this has a mapping element, and it takes you step by step through the process to look at various project types. But again, you can log in, create your own login information, and store information there about a project, link to it, and then come back. But it helps you to build this consultation package builder that you have there, CPB, as they call it. So it helps you do an impact analysis. It's a step-by-step process, again, that should help. So when you have time, not now, we've got a lot of great information to show you coming up next, but when you have time, go to those links. Go into the environmental review process, that IPAC system, to the endangered species page, and browse around. Again, those links will be there. Don't just do a Google. Go to Google Scholar if you're looking for really good information, and try to go first for endangered species information to either NOAA Fisheries or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or one of our state partner agencies that will provide you with a lot of good information there that tends to be a lot more reliable, especially for environmental review information, more reliable than some of the Wikipedia things that are maybe not always accurate. So with that, I want to hand off to Ruth. As Ruth was introduced earlier, she will be working in the ETDM to highlight some things in the EST. And if that's an alphabet soup, just stand by. Ruth will sort that out and help you out again with more online resources. Thank you.
Mark. Thanks, Mark. I'm going to be showing you a bit of the environmental screening tool today that supports our efficient transportation decision-making process. And so to provide a little context, ETDM is our standard procedure for beginning to address the environmental considerations and getting input from our agency partners early in the project development process during planning. It helps us get a heads up on feasibility of our projects. It helps us identify early on some avoidance, minimization, and mitigation opportunities that could be addressed as the project advances. And it helps us focus on important issues of concerns, topics that should be addressed thoroughly during PD&E so that we don't have to spend as much time on issues that aren't of concern. You know, why? Prove the negative. It also gives us information that we can advance into PD&E and use in our studies. And it provides some appropriate issue resolution processes during planning if needed to address issues that arise. This is the ETDM process. I'm not going to go into detail today. I just wanted to point out that there are 2 screening events during the ETDM process, the planning screen and the programming screen, that allow us to get our input from our agencies. This is when they review the projects. And we also publish the information to the public at that time. These screening events feed into the PD&E study and the PD&E phase. And the ETDM coordination that occurs with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries Service during ETDM is not the same as that consultation process that we've been talking about in this webinar series, but it does provide a framework and lots of good information that can help with that consultation process and help it go more smoothly and more efficiently. In order for us to communicate with our agencies and bring a lot of information together, we use the environmental screening tool. This is a web-based application that pulls information from multiple sources. Some of that very same information that Mark and Curtis just showed you, they've given to us, and we provided an environmental screening tool. So we're getting information from lots of different agencies and pulling it together so we can look at it at our projects. It also gives us a place where we can store and maintain the comments that we receive from the agencies so that we can pass that information forward as the project advances. At the foundation of the environmental screening tool is our Florida Geographic Data Library. The ESC is built on top of that. And so it gives a really strong foundation of GIS information from throughout the state of Florida, our federal agency partners, and a lot of different other sources. We work really closely with our agencies to keep our data up to date so that it can become a source of that best available data that I think it was John was talking about last week. So EST is often used for a preliminary desktop review to help us get an understanding of what's going on in the environment and about the species that are in the area. I do want to point out that we have both a secure site that requires a username and password. That's where our agencies enter their comments. That's where we edit our data before we publish it. When we publish the data, it also goes out to our public EST website, which is available to everyone. And the reports and maps that I'm going to show you today are available on both places. So if you don't have an account with the EST, don't worry about it. You can get to the information on our public environmental screening tool as well. So on the EST, we have over 280 data layers about protected species and habitat. It can be a little bit overwhelming. almost everybody's like, when they see it, they're like, whoa, how do I know how to get started? Well, we have a report that helps us get started, and that's our GIS analysis report. This report compares the location of our project to the location of all these different data layers about the protected species and habitat. And it queries it for looking for things that are within 100 feet, 500 feet, quarter mile, a mile of the project. And then it reports it on this report. And the first part is just a summary, just basically showing where there's something that's found. So as I scroll through this report, I initially see a lot of zeros. But for example, I also see here that there's some Gulf sturgeon critical marine habitat. So I want to take a closer look at that. That's some way I can start focusing on the data. So here you'll see the map is zoomed into a project. It's that red line going across the map. And we can add resource data using our map loader component in the upper left. There are two ways to search for the data. First, I can type in a word and then click on that little magnifying glass. And that brings up the results. And then I just click on those add to map and I can add whatever layers I want. It found several layers when I typed in the word sturgeon. And the second way I can find data is browsing through different topics. I click that browse button to open the layer browser, and then on the left there's different topics, and then it drills down into subtopics. For example, I'm in natural, wildlife and habitat, and then you'll see under there's a bunch of different things. For example, species, occurrences. There's also things like consultation areas, and there's also different habitat, land cover, lots of different data there. But when I click on a subtopic in the middle there, it brings up a list of the layers that are available. And then I can either add them all, or I can add one at a time by clicking on the buttons. And in this case, I'm just going to add that one. And then let's say I added a whole bunch of other ones. I have my map the way I want it. I can save it so that when I come back to it, I have those same layers. I don't have to research them, search for them again. Or I can just start exploring the data. There's some of the tools very similar to the ones you saw on Curtis's demo. For example, if I click on one of these little blue fish here, I get the identify results and I see it's a Gulf sturgeon sighting. Scroll down a little bit, you'll notice that in that table, there's actually a link to Google Maps where I can actually pull it up in Google Maps as well. So we have that integration between that. Also Google Streets, there's a tool for that as well. We have other tools in that left toolbar there, like measuring distances, adding bookmarks, drawing simple graphics to help illustrate key resources that I'm looking at, and I can create a PDF of the map as well. For more information about the map viewer, we do have videos and quick guides up on the upper right there under help if you want more details about using it. And in the EST, in addition to our GIS data and our map viewer, one thing that's really important to us is our ETAP comments. The EST is a repository of the comments that we get from our agencies. They're referred to as the Environmental Technical Advisory Team, or ETAP. Several of the people on this call are part of our ETAP. And it saves our responses to those comments. And then that information, as well as all that preliminary environmental information, is passed on to as the project moves to future phases. The ETAP comments are really helpful. They provide a lot more information on topics. For example, you may not be able to read this, but the actual comments provided on this project from Dave, where he went out to the field and looked at the site for us and gave some additional information, some directions about consultation that would occur in the future. They typically highlight critical path issues, tell us where we need to avoid things. They identify mitigation options, and when applicable, they can assist in the development, refinement, and potentially the elimination of alternatives. This helps us focus our PD&E study so we don't have to study things we know that won't work. They can also request to be cooperating or participating agencies, and all of this information, all of these comments really help us scope the PD&E and set the stage for our future coordination and consultations. So if you have any questions about the EST, go ahead and put the comments in the chat and we'll get to it when we take a pause. But with that, I'm going to pass it back to Mark. Thank you.
Okay. Well, before we go into programmatic agreements here, do we need to back up and catch a couple of these online questions? I think there were a couple there. One that's been answered, and if you have any of those, just want to make sure you get them to us while they're fresh on your mind and while we're still fresh on the previous information. Okay, we're getting a few there. Should we field those now, Katasha?
We can if you want, Mark, but we were going to try to do that at the end of the.
Okay. Well, go ahead and be typing those in while you're thinking about them, and I'll go ahead and maybe give you some more information about programmatic agreements. So, programmatic agreements are exactly what it sounds like: agreements that establish some streamlined processes for handling simple environmental requirements for those commonly encountered project types. I plan to give you a couple of examples of those, and if you aren't aware of these examples, they may be applicable to you, and hope that you'll, now that you become aware of them, that you'll be able to utilize these programmatic agreements. The important thing again is to remember that these are simplified processes for things that we do over and over again. Most environmental requirements for transportation projects have to be handled on a project-by-project basis. As we saw in the mappers earlier, everything is really site-specific. And so this does require DOT to initiate repetitive submissions, routine actions that often slow down the project's environmental review. And again, the emphasis here is that similar repeated projects with a predicted outcome can be dealt with in a programmatic manner. If we can predict the outcome of the environmental analysis, then we should be able to estimate what the potential outcomes are. So we've developed programmatic agreements to streamline the repetitive processes, and certainly if you haven't used one yet, using one of these programmatic agreements will help us design projects to, again, avoid, minimize, and mitigate for potential impacts, speed up that environmental review, and increase the transparency. You'll know what to expect. We know what to expect, and using one of these programmatic agreements shows that we've thought this out and can proceed that way. So one of the examples I want to talk about is our freshwater mussel programmatic approach. This is a rather recent programmatic agreement, and it applies mostly to District 3 activities here in the Panhandle in northern Florida, where we have quite a few endangered and threatened mussel species. And right now we're at at least 15 species that are covered under this, and it covers, again, all the way from the Escambia, yellow Choctawhatchee to the east in the Suwannee River. It's, again, recent, applies mostly to those activities such as bridges and activities that affect streams with mussels and mussel habitats. So the mussel programmatic agreement has two parts. One, the first phase of it focuses on DOT actions that either have no effect on mussels or may have an effect but are not likely to adversely affect, especially if you incorporate some conservation measures into the project, into project planning. keeping in place the proper erosion control measures and phasing of project construction to minimize effects on the stream and the habitats. And this will help you get to that no effect for mussels or one of the mantle of the may affect, but not adversely affect. So that's pretty easy if you use those measures and in the mussel programmatic agreement, and helps you move forward rapidly. The second part of that the programmatic agreement deals with the instances where a transportation project, even with the most careful planning, is going to be in an area where there are endangered mussels or designated critical habitat. And those projects are likely to adversely affect the mussel. But again, phase 2 of that programmatic agreement tells you what to expect, tells us how we're going to proceed with that process, and helps us all to do what we know. Again, because of having done it before, we know what the outcomes are, and we know how to minimize the effects to these habitats and the sensitive species that are in there. So that tells you a little bit about the mussel programmatic agreement, and I won't go much deeper into that because I know the folks in District 3 are fairly familiar with it, and again, have been utilizing it to as a basis for doing their environmental reviews for the past several years, and more, seems like more and more each year. Another class of programmatic agreements that I'd like to talk about are these keys, and our programmatic agreements that utilize keys are dichotomous determination keys. We have these in place for eastern indigo snake, Florida panther, Florida manatee, the piping plover, wood stork, and wood stork across its range, as well as a fairly new one for the Florida bonneted bat. These keys are really helpful for planning. They meet the if you meet the criteria in the determination key, the outcome is already established. We know how to deal with the common usages. These keys were mostly developed between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Corps of Engineers to be used during highway project development for permitting purposes, and certainly hope that if you haven't used those keys or seen them, by all means check into it. I guess the third group of programmatic approaches that I'd like to talk about is this one that was recently completed, less than a year old, for minor transportation activities, minor projects and maintenance projects, modernization things that are going on throughout the state, and some of these activities may result in no effect or minor effects. And so we don't send you through one of these long drawn out keys to only to find out that there aren't any species in the area. So this programmatic agreement that we have and this approach for minor transportation activities looks at those things that are occurring within the existing right-of-way limits. So focuses on the circumstances that were expected to again result in no effect to the endangered species, although we do have some endangered species that occur within rights of ways. This approach includes looking at the effects to the species in a new way, looking at the activity, at the transportation activity, and then the species commonly encountered. So included in the agreement there is measures to document the use and monitoring. So with an annual report coming out of OEM. So this really helps folks at the district level doing those things on a routine basis. And I think our next slide may highlight since this past July, the number of projects that are already been logged on the spreadsheet. As of last week, there were 173 projects that utilized this minor projects PA, 313 no effects, and then 54 of the MANLA may adversely affect, but not likely to, or may affect, but not likely to adversely affect, rather. And so looking at the activity matrix that we developed for this, primarily the big use has been for restoration, rehabilitation, and resurfacing existing pavement. So those repaving projects that you have going on, quickly run through the screen in the minor project PA, and you can make those no effect determinations. And that's been the greatest use for it so far, has been those in our matrix called B12. Also, installation or replacement of signs, fences, traffic signals, those sorts of minor activities, for the most part, are going to be no effect to endangered species, even sidewalks, trails, and multi-use paths that you're constructing, again, within the right-of-way, will lead to that same result. And this is something that the minor project PA can be used at the district level. You don't have to involve folks so long as it meets the requirements there. You don't have to involve folks at the Fish and Wildlife Service. We've already reviewed the agreement and the activities, and have agreed with OEM that this works, and you can make these determinations, check that off in your environmental review list. So again, the benefits of these programmatic agreements, if it's not already clear to you, is that we're trying to deal with repetitive actions. We aren't reinventing the wheel each time that we go out to pave a road or repaint the lines on it. Instead of doing it on a project by project basis, we've determined that there's classes of projects that meet these requirements. And if because you're designing the specific standards, we can review those standards. And in the case of the minor PA, you see that it reduces the level of time and effort that you have to spend in doing the environmental reviews. It also cuts down on all of the repetitive communication back and forth. You are not required to send a letter to the Fish and Wildlife Service to ask for a concurrence that your project is going to have no effect, because we've already said that if it meets these requirements, then it will be no effect. So we cut down on some of the usual sorts of communications back and forth on a project by project basis. We've done it on a programmatic level. It streamlines everyone's environmental review process, and you get that quicker turnaround. The timeliness and quality of your environmental review process, I think, is speeded up, whether it's using the muscle programmatic agreement, one of the determination keys, or the minor PA. Again, we're here to keep the simple things simple and save time so that we can work and focus more on conservation and the more complex ideas. We want to generate those consistent permit conditions that you know and expect to see in the requirements, and I think this does provide the predictability that enhances our relationship between the transportation professionals and regulatory staff at the agency. We're from the government, and we're here to help you. So with that, we're going to hear some more about another programmatic consultation, the JAXPO. You've heard it referred to, and Dr. Dave Rydeen will step in here, tell you some things about that, and hopefully clear up and make it more clear if you haven't used JAXPO. But again, if you have questions, put those in the chat box, and then we'll get back to them in just a minute. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Dave.
Hey, thanks, Mark. So this can be pretty quick because NOAA Fisheries does not really have any FDOT specific programmatics at this point. So at this point in time, NOAA Fisheries Southeast Region really only has one programmatic consultation that might be used by FDOT for minor in-water activities. And that's the programmatic that we did with the Jacksonville Corps that was signed in 2017. And so this programmatic is also known by the very catchy name of JAXPO, like Mark just said. So that just refers to the fact that it's a biological opinion that was done with the Jacksonville District of the Corps. So some of the in-water activities covered by JAXPO that FDOT might conduct are shoreline stabilization, and that would include the installation, repair, and removal of structures, pile-supported structures and anchored buoys. That's, again, installation, repair, and removal. Dredging, that would be maintenance dredging, minor dredging, or muck dredging maybe. Water management outfall structures and associated end walls, and that's, again, installation, repair, and removal. And, you know, sometimes there's boat ramps associated with bridges. So that's covered in JAXPO. That's installation, repair, and removal. So some more in-water activities covered by JAXPO. Aquatic habitat enhancement, establishment, and restoration activities. So that things like oyster reefs and living shorelines. So you might be putting in a living shoreline associated with a FDOT project, and you could use JAXPO for that. Transmission and utility lines, if you're running a power line out to the control station of a bascule bridge or something like that, you might use that. And also temporary platforms, fill, and coffer dams, and that's, again, installation, repair, and removal. So the caveat here in regards to JAXPO is that in order to use it, the Jacksonville Corps actually has to be the action agency asking for the Section 7 consultation. And that's because we did the biological opinion, the programmatic consultation with them. So you would have to get Jacksonville Corps to ask for the Section 7 consultation in order to use JAXPO. And the other thing is that you have to make sure you meet the specific criteria and conditions that are laid out for each activity in the JAXPO document. So make sure that your activity fits within that framework. And that's it for me for this one. So next we're going to shift gears and hear from NOAA Fisheries' very own Curtis Gregg, who will walk you through our consultation process using an example project.
Good morning again, everyone. As I mentioned earlier, in the ESA Section 7 mapper, the Long Key Bridge replacement was recently reviewed, so we're going to use that as the example project for conducting an ESA Section 7 consultation. The Long Key Bridge project area is kind of between the Middle Keys and the Upper Keys, between Long Key and Conch Key. And you can see the red line shows the boundary between the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council and the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council. So the Long Key Bridge work area is outlined in red here, and the aerial photography shows some interesting habitat features, some islands to the north, northwest, some water flow passages beneath the bridge and out to the south. So when an ESA Section 7 consultation comes in, we usually get a, from FDOT, we usually get a natural resource evaluation report with the consultation request. And the NRE provides some important information that's required in order to do the Section 7 consultation. One of the most important components is the determinations of effect of the project to ESA listed species and the rationale for the effects determinations based on the best available scientific information. That should have been in the slide. And the NRE also often includes measures to prevent the take of listed species. And the National Marine Fisheries Service staff, Dr. Rydeen and I, review the information in the NRE and coordinate with FDOT to make sure we have everything that we need to do the consultation. And that usually includes, results of benthic surveys to assess presence, abundance, and locations of ESA listed species, the input parameters for, the noise impacts calculator. That's going to be a topic of presentation, I believe, in the next session. Barge and work vessel drafts and potential exclusion areas if there's seagrass or, ESA listed corals in an area, and as well as, the usual water quality best management practices and anything that's proposed specific to the particular project under consultation. And then for projects like the Long Key Bridge, we also want to see how demolition debris is going to be controlled and prevented from discharge. That particular bridge occurs in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, and they have their own criteria to review as well. But we just want to make sure all of those things are covered. Some of the initial information that we look at when a consultation request comes in is shown here. On the left is a FWC GIS layer depicting where their GIS layers have mapped hard bottom. And it shows that underneath the Long Key Bridge, pretty much the entire length of the project, the Inwater portion of the project is over hard bottom. But hard bottom often has, sand and other unconsolidated sediments, and that allows seagrass to grow. And the screen on the right shows the FWC's seagrass layer. And this demonstrates a shortcoming of desktop only review of information. In nature, there aren't usually straight lines like you see here, and that's typically an artifact of mapping. It looks like whoever did the mapping didn't do the north side of the Long Key Bridge, and we would expect it to be similar, particularly looking at the aerial photography, similar in distribution and abundance to what we see on the south side of the Long Key Bridge. So based on the marine habitats that are present, and that's what those two layers show us, we can figure out what ESA listed species are likely to occur there. And this is also a point where we would use the ESA Section 7 mapper that was demonstrated earlier to show that the ESA listed corals would be expected there. The 5 species of sea turtles would be expected there. Small tooth sawfish, giant manta ray, Nassau grouper would be expected, and scalloped hammerhead sharks. So my question to the participants, do we have to consult on all of these species? And that question is a little bit of a ringer, something that Fernando Escaño and I Fernando in District 4 and I recently learned was that the scalloped hammerhead shark, while it is ESA listed, the distinct population segment that is the listed does not occur in Florida. So we would actually not include the scalloped hammerhead shark in this review. And then the second question is, do we consult on different life history stages and habitat for these species? And the answer is yes. If there's a project effect that would be specific to a particular life history stage, that would need to be dealt with in the routes to effect. And obviously designated critical habitat, for example, the staghorn coral and elkhorn coral, designated critical habitat in this area. Some of the sea turtle species have designated critical habitat here as well. So here's examples of some of the diverse marine species that are listed as either threatened or endangered. The map on the lower right is the distribution for Acropora cervicornis, the staghorn coral, and the photo above that And there is designated critical habitat in Florida for that. Giant manta ray that you'll hear more about coming up in Calusa's presentation. In the upper left is mountainous star coral, which was found in the project area for, I believe, the 7 Mile Bridge repair project that FDOT conducted recently. And, you know, some innovative contractor methodologies were developed and, you know, applied to that project. And then the Hawksbill sea turtle is an example of one of the 5 sea turtles that would occur here. And then in the center on the bottom is the Nassau grouper. Just to quickly point out, the black saddle right in front of the tail is how you tell a Nassau grouper. No other grouper has that black saddle. And you know, there are some threats to Nassau grouper from misidentification and take by you know, recreational fishers and scuba divers, spearfishers, for example. So I just wanted to point that out. Critical habitat is designated for some of these species, and additional habitat designations are pending rule development. And the additional designations will be addressed in session 4. So as I mentioned, the typical routes to effect. Yeah, there we go. The NRE and the assessment of information from the National Marine Fisheries Service reviews routes to effect. They can be different species can be affected by different project components, such as, you know, vessel strikes, sea turtles, or in particular, potentially small-tooth sawfish, and corals. You know, when a work platform or a barge comes up against a piece of the existing bridge, corals that are attached to that bridge can be crushed. So, you know, some way to stand off the work platform could address that. But entanglement for small-tooth sawfish and giant manta ray, noise impacts to sea turtles and Nassau grouper, you know, vessel anchoring, spudding, and grounding can affect corals, as well as designated critical habitat for staghorn and elkhorn corals. Construction equipment strikes, as I mentioned before, and then the pile removal can affect the attached corals. And there, below that on this slide are some examples of measures that are, you know, often proposed and included in the NRE or recommended by National Marine Fisheries Service to reduce the effects of the project. And you know, probably the first one under consideration is the recently updated protected species construction conditions that apply to pretty much all of the ESA consultations from now and moving forward. Things like daytime work only, slow speed of barges and work vessels, using observers to monitor for ESA listed species, making sure to monitor the turbidity barriers, any trailing lines off of the equipment for entanglement of ESA listed species, you know, slow starts, ramping up and pile driving, ramping up during pile driving, and using cushion blocks. A measure that, you know, depending on the results of the benthic surveys, prohibiting anchoring, spudding, or grounding over hard bottom or in seagrass has potential to conserve ESA listed species. And then inspecting the seabed and piles for ESA listed corals in the work areas, and then relocating any ESA listed corals that are found prior to the pile removal. And another question for the participants is, what is missing on these 2 lists? And so if you can think of the typical routes to effect what's missing, I would add that, you know, FDOT has special provisions and modified special provisions to reduce effects. And then another one that I thought of after I put the slide together was top-down construction, or construction from uplands are often used for those. So once we move through the review of information, you know, so far in my experience, the consultations that I've worked on have been informal consultations. They've included analysis of each of the routes to effect, and the determination by the National Marine Fisheries Service that take will be avoided. An informal consultation occurs as long as there's no take, and that all of the effects are beneficial, insignificant, or discountable. And in that case, the informal consultation results in a letter of concurrence by the National Marine Fisheries Service with the determinations made by the Federal Action Agency, which in this case is Florida Department of Transportation. If for some reason a formal consultation is required, the project can't happen without take of an ESA listed species being expected to occur. The Federal Action Agency provides a biological assessment to the National Marine Fisheries Service and NMFS staff, including the FDOT liaison, providing the initial review, as well as other Southeast Regional Office Protected Resources Division staff and the Southeast Regional Office of General Counsel collaborate to prepare a biological opinion using the biological assessment provided by the Federal Action Agency and the best available information. And the resulting document may include reasonable improvement measures to eliminate or reduce take, to prevent jeopardy or reduce unavoidable destruction or adverse modification of designated critical habitat. And as Dave mentioned in a previous presentation, you want to avoid having your project rise to that level of review. So that's all I've got in this portion of the presentation.
All right. Thank you, Curtis. Good information there, and really detailed explanation. I'd like to do a similar thing here, walk you through what happens in that black box that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has for project review. I want to go through and help you understand what we are looking for in information-wise for a project, and make it less of a dark box and more of an interactive conversation back and forth. So with that, I'll proceed. I'll let you know that the types of information that we use and who's doing it. So if you haven't met our transportation liaison biologist, we generally have 3 work areas across the state. District 3 is handled out of the Panama City office, and that position is currently vacant, but you can contact Jose Rivera. And email is a great way to contact us, because you can send in information or questions via email at any time you're thinking about it, and then we'll get back to you as soon as possible. But again, in Jacksonville over the past couple of weeks, you've heard from Zakiya Williams, and Zakiya's email address is there on the screen, as well as John Rublik was here last week with us and talked to you about the consultation process, and you can reach him if you see in the map the counties not divided along the same lines as the Florida DOT's districts, but there is some pattern there. You can see you may have worked with either Zakiya or John before, and if not, please get to know them. They really are here to help you, and by all means contact them by email, set up a chat or discussion with them. And if it's in any of those districts, or if you have a project in the near future, Jose Rivera will be glad to help out. We'll be restaffing that position very soon, so look for a name for District 3 in the future. If you have projects that have a broader level of effect, contact me by all means, and you can see my email address there. And I'm always willing. I may not have all the answers, but I'm always willing to point you to someone who may have a good answer. But this is the way generally we receive our projects for review. Next slide. If the districts send your request in for consultation or technical assistance, you can send them. Usually, I think our biologists are receiving the request for consultation directly by email from the districts, so that's great. I think there's a process, and we may hear more about it later, but you can submit it through the EST as well. And if that is not quite active yet, it will be very soon. But when a project comes in the door, we do track the project. We maintain electronic files for each of our project records, all the emails and letters, documents or attachments, and we keep that, maintain it in a project folder. But we also may put information into Ecosphere. It's Ecosphere is a great platform database. It's a national database for us where we can map and put information. And so when a project comes in to one of the liaisons here at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we review it along with our recovery and species biologist to help us analyze potential effects. So that's usually the first step, is when a project comes in the door, by whatever route, email or good old-fashioned mail, or if you deliver it in person, we'll review it with our biologist, other biologists in the office who may be more expert with the species. Some of those species experts we'll be hearing from a little bit later after the break, and so these are folks who are focused on a particular species, its recovery, and information that may be needed to consider potential effects of a transportation project. Next slide. So our biologists typically review when they have a project come in. They look at listed endangered and threatened species occurrences, along with consultation areas. Everything that we can usually begins on a ArcMap or Google Earth project basis. So that helps us determine, if you have a project in a particular area, which species might be affected by the project. What are the particular species to look for? We try to provide concurrence or request usually back within 30 or 60 days, depending on workload, depending on the complexity of the project. It may take a while. Okay, next slide. Again, in the Section 7 regulations that we talked about last week and the week before to some degree, the official government regulations refer to a biological assessment. Others might call it a natural resource evaluation or a biological evaluation, whatever the name of it. The information that we need in a biological assessment for a project that may affect a species is generally up to the action agency. But again, we in those regs need to have information about an on-site inspection. And again, the desktop basis is a great place to begin, but also we expect that you've done some on-site information gathering, and that's great to have that in your document when you submit it. If there are recognized species experts, then certainly they can provide a lot of information about the species and how a potential project may affect them. Include any literature that you've looked at, other information, and then really set out that analysis of the effects of the action. How will a particular transportation project affect the species and its habitat? How will it affect it during construction? How will it affect it during operation? And if there's any additional information to include, put that in your analysis. And for those of you who have done these documents, prepared biological assessments or natural resource evaluations, you're already thinking in those lines, but set that out in the analysis and then consider the alternative actions that might have been dismissed in favor of a particular proposed action. So all of those things are covered in that Code of Federal Regulations at 50 CFR 402.12 F. And so that description there, whatever you want to call it, biological assessment, natural resource evaluation, or biological evaluation. I think the Forest Service calls it a BE. We call it a BA. You may call it an NRE. Make sure all of that information is in there ready for review. Next. And really what I'm getting at is really we want to know the who, what, where, and when. This is basic news reporting. Who's going to do it? Who's building the project? Will it include any other permitting agencies? It's a good question. In general, as we've seen already this morning, the where is very important. And with the latest in technology, all of our geo-referenced project information is very important as a first line of a questioning. Where is the project going to occur? And then we go and compare that with where our species occur. And so that helps us determine the potential for effect on a project by project basis, species by species basis. So make sure that we do get a good location map. That's sometimes more difficult to dig up the where a project is. If you're referring to it in your reference to a particular county road or something, just provide us, especially by email. It's great to provide us with a KMZ or a shape file, or even just a good sketch map to let us know where a project will occur. That where is probably something that I will come back to again and again, but you've seen already how much mapping has to do with how we consider effects on a particular species. And then the other place that I really emphasize that's critical for us is to describe your action. What are you proposing to do? Include everything from the very beginning to the end. If you're just paving a road, of course, hopefully we've filtered out some of those things in the minor programmatic agreement. But if you're doing more than paving, tell us if there's relocation of utilities or borrow pits, stormwater ponds. If you have to, because of the location, you need a staging area to lay down materials or equipment, or you have to put in a temporary bridge. All of those things are part of the project. Now, I know you do leave that often to the contractor to decide those things, and by all means, if you can estimate where some of that will be in advance, it helps us to understand what the potential effect is if we know what is proposed. So tell us as much as you can, and even tell us this has not been determined yet. It's up to the contractor, and the contractor will be picking the particular construction phasing, or will be finding their own borrow areas. Just let us know. Lay that out as best you can. That's probably one of the biggest places that I'd like to see improvement is that as your engineers are describing an action, don't assume that our biologists always know what it means. So make sure that you spell it out and explain it as much detail as you can, so that we can understand what is proposed. Also, it may be important, especially if you have some particular seasonal components of the construction, or if it's going to last for a couple of years, that you let us know that as well. For some species, like our Gulf sturgeon, there may be part of their migration that could be interrupted with a temporary bridge or causeway, and so we want to make sure that when we're considering a project, that we work to minimize the potential effects of the project. So let us know if there's going to be something seasonally that's important for your project, as well as if it will be a multi-year project, something that we would need to consider in terms of the potential effects. So that that timeline is really important. So that's just plain English: who, what, where, and when. This is probably the most important section that you can have for us to help understand the potential effects, is in that biological evaluation there. Next slide. Other information you want to include, again, maps. I love maps. I like to see those. They're really visual. It helps us understand, again, where a project is occurring and how it may affect the species. Provide any figures, descriptions of the types of construction, or if you're using some new piece of equipment we may have never seen, describe that and explain it. Again, to emphasize that the folks reviewing for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, reviewing projects, are biologists. They specialize in species and habitats and the biological side of it. Make sure we can understand, draw us a picture so that we understand what the engineering designs are. As well, include the need for the project. Why is it being constructed? Help us understand what it's going to do, because those may also lead to other questions when you talk about the need for a project. Any other features of the project, especially if you've already thought about things that would minimize the potential effect to listed species or the critical habitat, make sure we know that you've already thought about those things. If you've done listed species surveys on site, let us know who did those and when, and what did you find. If you want to incorporate protective measures into the project, such as any of the manatee in-water construction conditions, if you are incorporating those, set that out as information for us to consider. Have you already thought about those things? If they're standard construction specifications, as Katasha explained last week, if you're including those, make sure that you make an affirmative statement that you're including those. And then that discussion of effects, and especially if there are no listed species or critical habitats there, let us make sure that's done. And again, as always, we use the best scientific and commercial information available. That's a standard that we use as a government agency, and so the best available is important. And let us know that you've used what you could. Again, the best information available. Next slide. So again, to maybe demystify and to lift the curtain a little bit, so that you can see when you submit a proposed project for review, we go through stepwise, considering, again, using species range maps, critical habitat maps, where your project may occur on or near these areas, where the species occurs. We also generally utilize the National Wetlands Inventory, NWI data, Great Layers. All of these are most of these are in the EST already in that mapper. We consider conservation lands, whether a project is on National Wildlife Refuge or state conservation lands, areas that are already set aside with a purpose, and so we consider that in our review. Just a teaser: next week we're going to hear some more from National Wildlife Refuges that may be on or around potential project areas. Just like everybody else, Google Earth is a great way to visualize things from the desktop, and Street View is widely available. If you tell us where something's going to be, we may first go to Google Earth and then zoom in and get a Street View. As well, our biologists, having worked in the area for quite some years, are usually familiar with district roads and the habitats that are along these roads. But we may make a site visit when warranted. I wish we could make a site visit for every project. That's something that, based on today's volume of requests coming in, we're not always able to do. But we do make site visits when we need to supplement the information that we've gathered from online resources. Next. Again, whenever we receive a written request by email or snail mail or hand it in, however we get that, we review the information and we consider the potential effects of a proposed project. And with that, we provide a written concurrence that, especially if it's a project that has no effect to a listed species or not likely to adversely affect, we'll let you know that. If we don't agree or we need additional information to clarify something, or if we need to go from informal consultation to a formal consultation, we'll let you know that as well. And so there are some established timelines for doing those things, and we want to make that as quick and easy as possible, and get you an answer back. Probably one of the best things you can do, especially if you have a complex project, I'll add here, is that if it's a really complex project, is even before you submit a request to the Fish and Wildlife Service, give us a call, send us an email and say, hey, I've got this really big project coming up, and I wanted to make sure that I've got all the information you need up front. Give us a heads up. Talk to John or Zakia or to me and let us know that. As I hope you've been seeing as we went through these slides, there's really no black box that we have. We're using the same information that hopefully you're using to make a determination of potential effect, and we use that same information and our species experts to analyze those effects and to determine the route, whether it's informal or formal consultation. The best thing you can do is don't say, ta-da, here's our project. We've been planning this for 5 years, and now we're going to give you 30 days to respond. Work with us if you, especially if you know it's going to be a complex project. Let us know ahead of time through the steps of your planning process, and talk with those biologists who are familiar with the area, and help them become familiar with your project before you even send it in. So we always appreciate a heads up, especially on those more complex projects, and it helps us plan our work and helps make sure that we get all the information that we need in order to analyze the proposed project. Let's see. With that, do I have another slide, or are we going to take some questions? And if you haven't already typed your questions into the chat box, do that, and Katasha will be glad to field as many of those. She's probably been watching the chat box and may be able to help cue them.
Mark, I think in the interest of time, though, I don't want our guest speakers to be rushed too much, and we've been chatting responses back to the audience as they come in. So I think what I'd like to do is maybe just touch briefly on a couple of questions, and then I think we need to take our break very quickly and then let our guest speakers go ahead and go. So there's been a couple questions about some of the tools that have been covered, and appreciate those folks that had a chance to do that. And so there's links in the responses, so make sure to check out those links. I think that one quick follow-up with regard to the ETDM and the EST is that even if your project is not being screened through ETDM, through that early review process that Ruth was describing, you still can use the layers in the EST to look at the potential species in your project, as well as those other tools that were covered by Curtis and Mark, the IPAC and the ESA mapper. So be sure to look at all your different available tools there. There was a question also about finding, opportunity for comments on the programmatic approach for minor transportation activities. And yes, we have been collecting possible improvements for that PA. So if you have other ideas, feel free to send those to either myself or Denise or Mark, and collectively we'll look at those and determine whether or not those are things that we feel like rise to the level of the effort to make those improvements. But we're certainly interested and have already been collecting those. So I think one quick question that I would like for Curtis or Dave to address is about JAXPO. briefly. And then Mark, if we can come back to the question for you later on at the end, I think that would probably be the most efficient use of our time for the moment. So there was a quick question about JAXPO being used when the Army Corps is the lead agency.
Yeah, so, you know, if the activity fits within the framework that's laid out in JAXPO, like I said, the Corps does have to be the action agency just because we did the programmatic consultation with them. But basically, if if they do that and it's determined that the activity fits within the framework that's laid out in JAXPO and meets all the criteria, then basically the consultation has already been done because that's why you do the programmatic.
Good deal. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate you following up on that. We did get one more question, but I think we're going to pause and hold those for the end and take a 5-minute break. So if we can come back at 10:31, we'll go ahead and get started with our species conversation. So thanks a lot, everyone. All right, everyone. Hope you had a nice, quick little break, got some coffee, had a chance to take a little nature break. Want to go ahead and welcome back, reintroduce Vicki Garcia to give us an overview of the snail kite. So Vicki, if you're ready, please go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Katasha. Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to talk about snail kites, and I'm just going to go ahead and keep my camera off during the presentation to avoid any bandwidth issues. Next slide, please. So snail kites were first listed as endangered in 1967, and the critical habitat was designated in 1977, and the polygons in that yellowish color are the areas of critical habitat. Next slide. And their range, their historical range has contracted. On the left, you can see the areas of their original range. And you can see that the wetland areas were more widespread. That's the gray parts. And they were also recorded as far north as the Panhandle. And we're not sure if those were just foraging sightings or areas where they were actually nesting, but there aren't as many records of them using that area as part of their range currently. The map on the right is their current range, which is just mostly consists of those large wetlands like the Everglades, Lake Okeechobee, the Kissimmee Chain of Lakes, St. John's Marsh. And we also do know that they've been using Paynes Prairie near Gainesville recently for the last few years on and off. Next slide. And snail kites are restricted to freshwater marshes and the shallow edges of lakes in the major areas that I mentioned in the previous slide. Next slide. And they nest in a variety of substrates, so they can create these pretty flimsy looking nests on cattail. They also nest in bulrush and small trees and bushes. And the nesting season is generally from December to July, but it can extend into August, September, October. Nesting peaks in March and April, but there has been nesting that has been recorded in every month of the year. So they can actually nest year-round. And just a brief overview of the nesting cycle. So from nest building until the juveniles are independent, that takes at least 4 months. So nest building takes about 11 days. The laying takes about 6 days to complete a 3-egg clutch, and then incubation is about 27 days. Then the nestlings are in the nest for about 29 days, after which they fledge. And once they fledge, the parents still feed them. And at first they don't fly well, but they start to fly well once they're about 6 or 7 weeks old. And the parents feed them until they're about 9 to 11 weeks old. And so that period lasts for about 4 months. And then the post-fledging stage, that's the period when they're at the highest risk of mortality. And that occurs for about that period lasts until they're about 5 months old. So 4 months after fledging is when they have the highest risk of mortality. Once they're about 5 months old, their risk becomes similar to that of an adult. And I just wanted to point out that snail kites can have multiple nests per year. If conditions are good, they may begin nesting. One of the pair might start a nest in with another bird. And they do also re-nest after failure. So if a nest fails, they may start one in, right in the same location, or they might move around depending on the conditions. Next slide. And here on the right is a map of the nesting that the University of Florida, the nests that the University of Florida has monitored since 1996. So the yellow dots are nests from 1996 to 2020, and the blue dots are the nests from last year, and then the red dots, which there's only a few up at the north that are hidden by yellow dots, those are the nests that we have currently. And so far, at least at the time that I created this presentation, the only nesting that we had in 2022 was up in Paynes Prairie. But, you know, obviously that will begin to, that will change as the season progresses. And here on the left is a table of, oh, can you do that? Yeah, so here on the left is a table of nesting success. That apparent success is how many of the nests are successful. And you can see that throughout the years, nesting success has remained relatively stable. So about a third of nests that snail kites initiate actually produce nestlings, or sorry, actually produce fledglings, which is what we consider to be successful. Okay, next slide. So that was nesting. As far as foraging goes, they forage along sparse emergent vegetation or along the emergent edges of you know, thicker or denser clumps of vegetation. Next slide. And their diet consists almost exclusively of apple snails. So initially, snail kites forage almost exclusively on native Florida apple snails. But since the non-native island apple snail has become so widespread, snail kites have been foraging on those readily. The shell on the left is the non-native apple snail, and you can see that it's much bigger than the native apple snail. So if a kite manages to grab one of those, they're getting a lot more energy for their efforts. So they do forage on the non-native apple snail, and they're just so widespread. Often it's, you know, you see the eggs of the non-native apple snail much more frequently than you see the native apple snail eggs. The pink ones on the right are the non-native. It's okay, you can go to the, yeah. And so snail kites hunt prey on the wing or from perches, and they often return to the same spot to consume their prey, especially if they're nesting. And so that's where you get these aggregations of apple snail shells, like you see in the picture on the bottom left, where these are snail kites that have been perching in the same place. They drop their shells as they eat, and then you see what looks to be just a pile of shells. Next slide. And this map on the right is data from 67 kites that were tagged as nestlings from 2018 to 2021. And so this indicates the areas that they use to either forage or roost. And you can see that even though their nesting is restricted to these large wetland areas, they do forage and use many other sites throughout the state. Next slide. And I just want to highlight a few of these sites just for interest, and they're all in Southwest Florida. So I'll just show you, if you just draw your attention to the red circle at the bottom left of the map. Next slide, please. So that circle is an area off of Tamiami Trail and Route 29, and the pink lines on this slide, that's a snail kite that was using this area just right off of Tamiami Trail for about 3 months. And so you can see that even though this is not strictly inside what we would consider their nesting range or the area of their range, they can use these sites, and you can see that they cross the road occasionally. Next slide. And then here's another area, another circle that I want to just show you briefly, and this is near Naples. Next slide. So this is an area, the green lines are a snail kite that was using this area for about 250 days, so for about 8 months. And you can see that this doesn't necessarily look like snail kite habitat, but obviously there was enough prey, enough apple snails in this area for the snail kite to occur or to subsist here for 8 months. And just to direct you, on the left is I-75, and then the road on the bottom is Immokalee Road. So you can see that it wouldn't necessarily jump out as snail kite habitat, but it did support a snail kite. Next slide. And then the final area is just this area near Bonita Springs. Next slide. So you can see Corkscrew Road here. And there was a snail kite that was using this area for about 3.5 months. And you can see that it was readily crossing the road, going back and forth using this area. And so the point here is that even if there are areas that are outside of the nesting range or areas that wouldn't jump out at you as snail kite habitat, there might be snail kites using the area, and they might be close to the road and crossing the road if there's enough forage. And sometimes just along ditches along the road, there's enough apple snails to support a snail kite for an extended period of time. Okay, next slide. And just to give you an overview of the current status of the snail kites. So on the y-axis here is the superpopulation size. So that's essentially the population size throughout its range. And you can see that since 1999, it began a pretty steady decline and reached kind of a bottom in 2009. And that's when it's believed that that's when the non-native apple snail first began to spread. And after the spread of the non-native apple snail, the population began to climb steadily until about 2017. And since then, it started to fluctuate up and down. In 2019 and 2020, nesting was pretty poor. There was no nesting on Lake Okeechobee for snail kites in those 2 years due to low lake levels, and nesting was poor in general. And so the 2020 and 2021 population estimates, which are based on nesting the previous year, both of those are expected to show a decline. So that means that the snail kite population has been declining now for 2 years in a row, which is something that is of concern because they're already starting to decline back to a level where we were hoping that they would stay above. So we're watching to see what the next estimate shows, and hopefully it won't be a third year of decline. Next slide. The main threats to snail kites are eutrophication and stabilization of lakes. Stabilization meaning the stabilization of water levels, because wetlands typically have these, water levels that change both within years and among years. But when the water levels are stabilized, that means that some vegetative communities take over, and those aren't necessarily supportive of snail kites. We also, other threats are habitat loss due to other factors such as wetland loss, lack of aquatic and emergent plant management, issues with hydrologic management in areas where water management is where water is heavily managed. Sometimes there's issues with competing interests for what to do with that water. Other threats are nest disturbance, contaminants, and then climatic extremes. Next slide, please. So as far as project planning goes, we do have some conservation measures, and these measures can be tailored to any specific project, and we can work with you ahead of time to develop these conservation measures so that they fit in with your project. I'm just going to go through a few of the highlights and kind of general measures that we typically suggest. So the first is snail kite surveys and monitoring, an initial survey prior to project activity, and then if snail kites are present or could be present, then ongoing monitoring. If there are snail kite nests that are found, then implementation of nest protection buffers. So that's a 500-foot buffer around the nest, which is a no entry buffer to avoid disturbing the snail kites at the nest, and then a 500-meter radius around the nest, which is a limited activity buffer in which we're hoping to avoid any disturbance to foraging habitat and to water levels, so that the snail kites are able to, go through their nesting cycle with their habitat in the same way as it was when they chose it. So no radical changes in what's going on around their nest and in the area where they forage. Next slide. And this is what the nest buffers look like. The red lines are the 500-foot buffers, and then the yellow line is the 500-meter buffer, which is, if you're outside of these lines, in general, it should avoid any disturbance to the snail kites. Other conservation measures are the presence of a qualified biologist who is there if there's activity within 700 feet of an active nest, either suspected or confirmed, and that would be someone who is in contact with us if there is any issues regarding disturbance or any questions regarding activities. Another conservation measure is an education plan that would be other project personnel would be involved in this, and it would just involve providing a description of the snail kite, its habits, behaviors, the conservation measures, instructions not to injure, harm, or harass, and then instructions on who to contact if there is any issues with snail kite behavior. And then there's some reporting measures. So obviously, if there's any nests that are suspected, the point of contact would contact us directly within 24 hours of it being found. And then aside from that, it would be, we want the results of the initial survey prior to commencing project activities or construction. And then weekly snail kite monitoring reports sent directly to us. And then a final report once the construction activities are completed. So those are some of the measures that we could use to make sure that there's no impacts to snail kites. And we also have some survey guidance that we can provide just to kind of instruct the biologist who's doing the surveys, or to kind of give some guidelines on how they would conduct these surveys to maximize the potential of finding snail kite nests if there are any snail kite nests present. And if these are followed, then we would consider the survey to be valid if it's being done by a qualified biologist. I'm happy to work with anyone to develop these conservation measures or the monitoring plan or the survey methods, or to answer any questions relating to snail kites. That's back over to you, Tasha.
Great, thanks, Victoria. I really appreciate that presentation, very thorough, and I appreciate you specifically kind of talking about how it can relate to the transportation projects and what we need to be mindful of as we're doing our surveys, right? And so kind of those couple of examples about how may not look like great habitat, but it could be. So just kind of being a little bit more aware of that is really good. So we do have a question about how do you define a qualified biologist? I would imagine that's probably discussed a little bit in your survey protocols, but would you be able to maybe help us understand that based on those definitions that you guys have?
I'd have to refer back to the conservation measures. So I'm not sure that I can answer, except to say that I think that the consultants that are typically employed would count as qualified biologists, which is not to say that other folks wouldn't also be able to function. If FDOT has its own biologists, I think that would work, but I don't want to speak out of turn. So that might be something that I can get back to you all on what are the specifics of a qualified biologist. I don't think we're going to be looking for, any kind of certifications, as long as the person has a degree and has been working.
Right, a lot of times not super specific. But okay, that'd be great if you don't mind getting back. That would be really good. Not seeing any other specific questions in the chat, but I was just kind of curious if you had any more knowledge about the native apple snails versus the invasive apple snails, and just is there any, like, has anybody done a study? You showed that really awesome picture of that pile of remaining shells or whatever, but is anybody kind of looking at sort of the percentage of times that the kites are eating, say, the natives versus the non-natives, or is it just kind of opportunistic, or any feedback on that?
Yeah, we do know that they preferentially, well, first of all, the non-native is far more widespread than the native at this point. So in many of the lakes that you go to, they're almost exclusively using non-native apple snails just because that's what's most present. And I would say that they preferentially use the non-native, especially as adults, because they are so much bigger. And I know that in areas where the non-native apple snail is not as widespread, such as the Everglades, the snail kites are also less likely to nest there. That's where we're seeing the ongoing declines in the number of birds that are nesting in these areas. So it's really the spread of the non-native apple snail that has allowed that population to bounce back.
Which kind of ties into this next question that we did get about any insights for that recent decline. And so maybe there's that observation. Are there any other observations that you guys have for those declines that you've been seeing?
Yeah, so I do think that the poor nesting conditions on Lake Okeechobee, which is a huge nesting area for snail kites, they drew the lake down in 2019 to try to address some of the impacts due to high water. So the lake was low for a year and no snail kites nested there. And then the following year was relatively dry, and so the lake remained low and no snail kites nested there again. And that led to, I think Lake Okeechobee is so important that led to a decline in the overall population, just because the breeding effort was so limited. Now, we did have a pretty good number of nests in 2021. So nesting success was not good at some sites, but we're waiting to see if that results in an uptick in the population. But essentially, dry years are going to be bad for snail kite nesting, but we do expect there to be dry years, so that's okay. It's just when you get multiple years in a row that do lead to multiple years of decline that it becomes problematic.
Makes sense. Thanks for those insights. We have another question. Does creating feeding stations help them feed on the larger snails?
I don't think that feeding stations are necessary for them to use the non-native apple snails, because they don't seem to have any trouble finding them when they're present. So I don't know that we're at a stage where we will want to begin that kind of intervention where we're creating feeding stations for them. Yeah, they seem to be doing okay at finding those non-natives.
Well, that's at least good news, I guess.
Yes.
Okay. Well, great. Thanks so much for your presentation and for being with us today. If you're sticking around and there's any more questions, we can certainly get you to answer those at the end, or if you need to leave, we can certainly forward those on to you and get responses for the audience. And then if we could maybe, was there one more? Okay, looks like one more quick question if you have a second, Victoria. Are there any plans to try to control the non-native snails?
I know they're doing this in other states where that non-native apple snail, like Louisiana, I know they're trying to control them there. That would be problematic for snail kites if that occurred here. It's not clear, even though the non-natives can outcompete the natives, it's not clear that the non-natives are the reason that the natives declined. So the natives seem to already be in decline. So I don't know of any plans at the moment to control non-native apple snails here in Florida.
Thanks for that answer too. Okay, I think we will go ahead and switch over to Calusa. Thanks again, Victoria. Again, we really appreciate your presentation today. And Calusa, Thank you as well for being here with us to talk about the giant manta ray. And go ahead and take it away. Thanks.
No reason. Can everybody hear me? I just want to make sure.
We can hear
Okay.
you. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. This morning, I'm going to talk to you, give you a brief overview of giant manta ray, its threats, and highlight some of what NOAA is doing to protect the manta ray. Next slide. So the giant manta ray is a really unique species. It's one of the world's largest rays, and its wingspan goes up to 29 feet. They are elasmobranchs, meaning that they have skeletons made out of cartilage instead of bone. They have wing-like pectoral fins, and they have two really unique fins called cephalic lobes that extend from their mouths, giving them the horned appearance. They use these cephalic lobes to help funnel prey into their mouths. They are filter feeders, and they eat large quantities of zooplankton. In addition, they have one of the lowest fecundities of all elasmobranchs. They don't reach maturity until they're around 10 years of age, and they only give birth to one pup every 2 to 3 years thereafter. This significantly impacts their ability to recover from any removals or losses. Some interesting facts about manta rays are they're super smart and have the biggest brain of any fish studied to date. They can exercise memory, can extinguish between objects, and recognize themselves in the mirror. This type of self-awareness has only been observed in great apes, bottlenose dolphins, and elephants. Manta rays aren't like stingrays. They are harmless and they don't have barbs or stingers. They are also ram ventilators, which is different from stingrays in that ram ventilators, they're required to continuously swim to breathe, whereas most stingrays can sit on the seafloor and don't need to continuously move. Next slide. So giant manta rays are migratory and they exist in small fragmented populations across the globe. They occur in tropical, subtropical, and temperate bodies of water and are commonly found offshore and in productive coastal areas. In the southeast, they have also been observed in estuarine waters, oceanic inlets, and within bays and intercoastal waterways. Next slide. While the species has a fairly extensive range, we have been working towards improving our understanding of their distribution. Recently, we developed, in collaboration with our partners, a species distribution model. The model predicts where manta rays are most likely to occur based on sea surface temperature, water depth, and productivity as inferred from thermal fronts and chlorophyll A concentrations. Based on this model's predictions, we have improved our insights on where, when, and how manta rays are likely to occur in the Atlantic and within Gulf of Mexico. We found that the highest nearshore occurrence tends to be off of northeastern Florida in April. However, as temperatures warm from June to October, this distribution of manta rays extends northward along the shelf's edge with higher occurrences north of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. As temperatures cool from November to March, manta rays are more prevalent south of Savannah, Georgia. In the Gulf of Mexico, the highest occurrence was predicted around the Mississippi River Delta from April to June, and again from October to November. Next slide. So other important habitats include nursery areas. Locating and documenting nursery areas is a priority in manta ray research and in their conservation. Over the last few years, researchers have studied and documented 2 nursery areas, both of which occur in the southeast US. These are the only 2 nursery habitats that have been described worldwide. One is located in the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary in the Gulf of Mexico, and the other is located near shore along Florida's southeast coast. This is a very urbanized area and is around West Palm Beach. Next slide. Why is NOAA Fisheries interested in doing anything with giant manta rays? So in 2018, we listed giant manta ray under the Endangered Species Act as a threatened species. Our review of the species found that the most significant threats to the species was harvest and bycatch in fisheries. Giant manta rays are targeted and caught as bycatch in a number of industrial and artisanal fisheries throughout the range. While they were traditionally targeted for their meat, since the 1990s, a market of giant manta ray gill rakers has significantly expanded, increasing demand, particularly to China. Gill rakers are used in traditional Chinese medicine, similar to shark fins. Since this boom in harvest, the species has experienced significant population declines. For example, within the Indo-Pacific and eastern portion of the species range, sightings and landings have declined up to 95%. While there are no historic or global population estimates, the regional population sizes are believed to be small, ranging from 100 to 1,500 individuals. Next slide. So while the most significant threats, as I just described, is directed harvest and bycatch that largely occurs overseas, there are several domestic threats that are impacting the species. We consider these threats in our Section 7 consultations. In most cases, we are just now beginning to understand these threats, and the overall impact on the species viability is largely unknown. So I'll go in and touch base on some of these threats in the following slides. And I just wanted to note this is a really cool picture. Sorry. The picture before, you can see, yes, how close giant manta rays occur to developed areas in South Florida and in Florida in general, which I thought it was just a really neat picture. Right, go to next slide, please. Okay, so giant manta rays are hit by vessels, which can cause, as you can see here, significant injury and or mortality. Giant manta rays are vulnerable to vessel strikes while they're feeding at the surface and or basking. They are frequently observed feeding in and around inlets also, which are areas of high vessel traffic. We have numerous reports of giant manta rays that show evidence of propeller wounds and prop scars. The majority of these reports are coming from a relatively small area along Florida's East Coast. This area is regularly surveyed by researchers, so we're getting more information, but it also suggests that vessel strikes may be occurring at higher rates than we previously thought. Next slide. So recreational anglers also interact with giant manta rays. They are foul hooked from fishing piers, vessels, and shore-based fishing. They can be hooked from fishing piers. Our observations indicate that manta rays don't swim beneath the pier, but they swim parallel to the pier and then round the pier at its terminus, which is where typically anglers are more concentrated. An interesting anecdote, last year during our field work, we witnessed a manta ray becoming foul hooked from a pier shortly after being tagged. This incident was really surprising to us because the anglers on the pier saw the divers in the water, saw the research vessel, saw the manta ray, and didn't do anything to change their behavior, didn't pull up their lines. This incident really demonstrated the need for us to increase angler awareness and our outreach efforts and to develop educational pier signage. In addition, cobia anglers specifically target manta rays to fish cobia off of them. This is a common practice along Florida's East Coast and is likely at the source of significant foul hooking incidences. We are in the process of developing relationships with cobia anglers and charters to help address these issues. As far as the shore-based shark fishing, we're working with FWC to include manta ray conservation and information about manta rays in the required classes for shoreline shark anglers. Next slide. Now, while there's no directed harvest for giant manta rays in the U.S., giant manta rays are subject to bycatch in pelagic longline, bottom longline, gillnet, and trawl fisheries. We are currently assessing the extent of these interactions and considering how we can mitigate and reduce these interactions during our Section 7 consultations. To date, we have developed safe handling and release guidelines for commercial fisheries. We are working protected species fisheries observer programs to improve data recording and reporting, and as well and tissue sampling. We are taking genetic samples of bicod individuals to help us better understand the population dynamics. We're also funding studies to explore bycatch mitigation methods to decrease the number of interactions between fishing gear and giant manta rays. Next slide. So like many other marine animals, giant manta rays can become entangled in lines and boat mooring lines. We don't really have a good understanding of the extent of this threat, but we know when it does occur, which we have several documented reports of it occurring throughout Florida, that is typically lethal. Giant manta rays, they have eyes located on the side of their head. So they have really limited vision in front of them. And what we believe is happening is that when they become entangled, they run into the line and the line hits them between their cephalic lobes, and then they instinctively roll, which loops the line around their cephalic lobes. And because they're ram ventilators and they need to continuously swim, this can result in them drowning. We recommend that in-water lines be kept taut, wrapped in a plastic sleeve to prevent looping and reduce the risk of entanglement. These are similar guidelines for, I believe, other marine mammals as well. So with all this in mind, what are we doing to help protect and recover giant manta ray? First, we have developed a recovery outline, which is the interim guidance document that is used to support conservation while a full recovery plan is being developed. Recovery outlines presents a preliminary strategy for recovery of the species and recommends high priority actions that are designed to stabilize and recover the species. Outreach, we are continuing to increase awareness of this amazing species through featured web stories and social media. We also have an email address that we're working with the general public where they can report manta ray sightings, which helps us populate our sightings database and increase citizen participation in giant manta ray conservation. And of course, we work with our fellow partners through Section 7 consultations to avoid and minimize effects to giant manta ray from federally permitted activities. And I think that's about it for me. I'm happy to answer any questions, and also note that my email is in the beginning of the slide, beginning of the presentation. So if anybody has any questions after the fact, then I'm happy to email me, or and I'll do those for you.
Thanks so much, Kalisa. That was also really great, and appreciate all the really good pictures and information sharing. And it kind of ties back into some of the stuff that I think Curtis was talking about with his project example too. Some of those conservation measures that you were talking about with the vessel strikes and things. So really great. Let's see. Are turbidity controls a concern for the giant manta ray entanglement?
I would have to look at our conservation. We have the protected species conservation measures that for construction conditions. I think that the recommendation would be to make sure that those lines, that they're monitored and they're kept taut so they don't impose an entanglement risk.
Right, very similar to the other species that we have kind of those conditions for as well.
And I always like to tell people when they think of sea turtles, they probably need to think of manta rays. So you're thinking of the same things, construction noise, debris, vessel strike, and entanglement. And so those are the primary things that we'll see for like bridge construction and things like that I think FDOT would be interested in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and then it makes it a little bit easier for our contractors too, right? You're kind of thinking about all those same things for a host of species that may be within those project limits. So good, thanks. Right. Are lobster traps or other traps posing entanglement dangers?
Well, we actually just got we didn't know initially, but this this last couple months, or I think it was like this month, we actually had an observation of a manta ray caught in a trap line off the east coast of Florida. So yes, it does appear that they are entangled in those lines as well.
So lots of hazards out there for them. I had a kind of question to follow up about your slide where you talked about, you know, them having a really large brain and, you know, being able to notice themselves in a mirror. Like, are they super social animals like some of the other species that do have those same characteristics? Yeah.
There was a paper just recently published on their socialization, and that they have friends and they form social bonds with other manta rays. Yes, but they're typically solitary, but they do form those bonds.
So neat. Another question: how far up rivers have they been documented?
So they don't occur typically in freshwater environments. We do. There was some reference to the Section 7 mapper, and they are in there, but we don't really occur. We wouldn't consider them in rivering habitats. Intercoastal waterways, marine bays, and that's about it, really. Estuaries, like we've had reports of them in the IRL, in the Indian River Lagoon, and in Tampa Bay, and places like that. As long as it's an oceanic bay and has a connection to the ocean, they can come into the bays, and they do utilize intercoastal waterways, especially around on Florida's east coast.
So another thing that we've kind of been interested in here at DOT and kind of working with Mark and others is eDNA. And so you mentioned some tagging opportunities that you guys have done. Have you used eDNA at all yet for this species to kind of find out more about it? Okay.
Not yet, but it's definitely something that is on the list of things. Right now, we're really trying to focus on genetics and population structure and connectivity, and trying to get a good read on what habitats they're using, as you can see, when they're using them, what makes those areas so unique, and abundance, like really understanding like what's going on with the populations.
They're all important things to know for sure. So, all right. So we'll maybe just do one more last call to see if there's any additional questions for Kalisa. But yeah, this has been really great. I think it's, you know, just seeing the pictures and hearing the kind of the life histories and getting some more information about them helps us kind of better understand the species and thinking about those and how they can, you know, interact with our projects and everything. So
yeah,
thanks so much for your time. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Oh, it was, you know, and I do want to say that, like, you know, I think that a lot of people, when they think of giant manta rays, they think of like offshore, you know, they're far offshore, and that's not the case here in Florida, or really in the Southeast. They're very close to shore, and they come in those intercoastal waterways and estuaries and things where, you know, there might be some activities that could affect them. So,
and especially that nursery area, right? So, and there's one more quick question about the seasonal aspect of is there a seasonal aspect in the nursery areas?
So we don't know for the flower garden banks, but for the East Coast area, they're always, it seems like they're always there. Florida Manta Project has been serving the population for about 5 or 6 years now, and they see juvenile manta rays throughout the year, but they seem to be more, they occur more during the summertime. Like they're seeing more of them during the summertime, and then we think that like as the waters warm north, they kind of move up north, but the juveniles are typically hanging out along the east coast of Florida, West Palm Beach apparently, which is just insane because it's so developed.
Yeah, good place to hang out, I guess. Right. Here's a really fun question that I didn't think of, but I think it's great. Do manta rays jump out of the water?
They do.
Cool.
They do. Yeah, I actually had a picture in there that I took out of one jumping out of the water, and there's like a surfer in the background. Yes, they do jump out of the water.
That's awesome. I bet that's a pretty cool sight to see. So.
Yeah, considering how large they are, yes. It would be very, I've yet seen it.
Do they jump on a boat like a sturgeon though? I mean, like, has that happened?
I would hope not. That would hurt. No, they have. I have never. I haven't heard of one actually jumping and hitting anybody yet.
Maybe they're too smart for that. But
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks again, and we'll definitely send any other questions your way if they come up in the meantime. But thank you very much. We'll go ahead and take one more really quick break, and let's come back at 11:21. We'll have some more talk about sea turtles. Thanks, guys. Okay, looks like our break time is up, and we will have our next species profile on sea turtles by Luke Davis with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So Luke, if you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Katasha. So Karen Frucci is our species recovery lead for sea turtles and was unable to attend this presentation, so I was asked to step in. As mentioned previously, I work with sea turtles, manatees, and some inland species out of our Jacksonville office. And I worked previously with Katasha and Denise, and we made a lot of headway on sea turtle lighting issues, and I'm happy to continue that work today. Next slide. So of the 6 sea turtle species that are found in US waters or that nest on US beaches, all are designated as either threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. Loggerhead, green, leatherback, and hawksbill sea turtles regularly nest on beaches within the US and all depend upon US coastal waters for foraging and migratory habitat during certain stages of their life history. The Kemp's Ridley sea turtle, which occasionally nests in the US, it's really low numbers, is dependent on shallow coastal habitats of the US East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico for foraging and developmental habitat. All of these species migrate outside of the US boundaries during their lifetimes. And in addition, the olive ridley, which isn't shown on this page, does not nest in the US, but during feeding migrations, olive ridley turtles nesting in the Pacific may disperse in the waters of the southwestern US, occasionally like as far north as Oregon. So the US Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service share federal jurisdiction for sea turtles, with the service having lead responsibility on the nesting beaches, and NOAA and National Marine Fisheries Service the marine environment. And you're going to get a talk from NOAA on more specifics, so I'll try not to overlap too much. Federal responsibilities and programs include development and implementation of recovery plans, land acquisition, cooperative programs with states, consultation with other federal agencies on projects they fund, permit, or conduct. There's international cooperation and promulgation of regulations to reduce take, permitting activities for research or education involving take, and the development of habitat conservation plans. So we'll go on the next slide, a little bit of their life cycle. So there's 3 main habitats during the life cycle of each of the sea turtles: the beach environment, the nearshore waters, and open waters. And like I mentioned, NOAA is going to go into more detail on the oceanic part of their life cycle and the threats they face in the marine environment. So I'm going to try to focus mine more on the life cycle and threats they face on the beach and how that relates to some of the projects that you'll be working on. So after emerging from their nest, hatchlings crawl towards the sea using as their guide like near ultraviolet to green light, which provides a consistent seaward marker regardless of the phase and position of the moon. They likely imprint on the magnetic signature of the coastal areas so they can return to their natal waters and beaches to mate and nest when they become adults. After the hatchlings enter the sea, they begin a swim frenzy for several days, swimming offshore until they reach safety with the protective masses of floating seaweed in areas where ocean currents meet. These drift lines, they provide food and places to conceal juvenile turtles from predators, and they drift there for a year or more until they reach a certain size or age, at which time they return to some nearshore waters. And as adults, female sea turtles return to the same beaches where they hatched to lay their eggs, often navigating across like great expanses of water. So part of the over-harvesting for eggs historically for food and intentionally killing of adults, immature turtles for their shells and their skin, and accidental drowning and commercial fishing gear are primarily responsible for the worldwide decline of sea turtle populations. And in addition, you have coastal, residential, and commercial development, degradation of nesting habitat, and pollution of ocean that threatens foraging habitats that led to the listing. So next slide. So this is an example showing just the loggerhead range that includes each stage of the life cycle and different subpopulation nest in different areas of the world. So you can see that's on the right, and on the left shows some critical habitat for loggerhead species in Florida and some of the Southeast. Currently, NOAA and the service are working on 5-year reviews for Northwest Atlantic loggerhead, hawksbill sea turtles, Kemp's Ridley sea turtles, and green turtle critical habitat. So these show here the critical habitat units for the southeastern US and the global range for the loggerhead sea turtle. In Florida, nesting occurs on all sandy beaches along the coast, inlets, and portions of the inland side of barrier islands. So that includes most of the Florida coastline, except for portions of the Big Bend area. However, sea turtles are found throughout the marine waters of Florida, so as it's important foraging habitat for and mating grounds. Next slide. So we'll get into a little bit of the beach environment and nesting activity. So during nesting season, which in the continental US occurs between March and October, female sea turtles come ashore to lay their eggs. Leatherback sea turtles can nest as early as February and are mostly found nesting in Brevard through Broward counties in Southeast Florida. Loggerhead and green turtles nest as early as April. You usually see the dates of May 1st through October 31st and March 1st through October 31st in counties Brevard through Broward. But they can nest earlier and hatching could occur later in season, so that's important to note. So basically what happens here, because nests are typically laid between the high tide line and the dune front. Green turtles do have a tendency to nest like into the dune vegetation. Females, that what they do is they excavate pits using their fore and rear flippers to remove the upper layer of dry sand. Then with their bodies in the pit, they use their rear flippers to dig egg chambers in the moist sand. And females lay between 50 to 160 eggs, depending on the species. And they're about the size of ping pong balls, and they cover the eggs with sand and return to the water. The species and nest location to mark for protection and data collection can be determined by the tracks left in the sand found by the state's network of permitted volunteers, which you can see in this picture here, the tracks laid. So when volunteers come the next morning and see that, based on their training and education, they can tell what type of species that is by the tracks of the flippers and where the nest location is based on that camouflage and where that body pit is likely. The eggs incubate for 50 to 70 days. The warmer the sand surrounding the egg chamber, the faster the embryos develop. And on the next slide, we're going to look at some of the nesting numbers. So the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission compiles nesting numbers for Florida using the network of permitted volunteers. And shown here that the 2021 numbers aren't available yet. They're still being collected, which they should probably be released anytime now. But the table here shows the 2020 numbers, and the graphs below show the nesting numbers for each of the 3 main species. The graphs may be a little difficult to read specifically, but I just wanted to get you an idea of a visual of the nest numbers by year and the volume for each of those 3 main species. The table shows both the number of nest and the number of non-nest emergences. That's the N for nest and the NNE for non-nest emergences. Those are also called false crawls. Those are listed here because it's difficult to determine the exact cause of a non-nest emergence. because there are many factors that contribute both naturally and from human disturbance. You'll probably notice a little in the one in the middle of the graph, the green turtles, and the one on the right, the leatherback turtles. There's several like peaks and valleys, and that's typically because occasionally female green turtles produce clutches in successive years. Usually 2 or more years intervene between breeding seasons for them. And for leatherbacks, nesting migration intervals of 2 or 3 years are typically observed. And on the next slide, we'll discuss more hatchling behavior. So hatchlings, once the eggs are laid, after they've been incubated, the hatchlings will pip and escape from their eggs over 1 to 3 day intervals and move upward out of the nest over like a 2 to 4 day interval. The hatchlings typically emerge in mass almost exclusively at night, presumably using decreasing sand temperature as a cue. Hatchlings use a progression of orientation cues to guide their movement from the nest to the marine environments where they spend their early years. Hatchlings first use light cues to find the ocean. Naturally lighted beaches without artificial lighting. Ambient light from the open sky creates a relatively bright horizon compared to the dark silhouette of the dune and the vegetation landward of the nest. And this contrast guides the hatchlings to the ocean. So away from the dark silhouettes and towards the brightest horizon, which on a dark beach should be kind of the celestial bodies, the moon and the stars reflecting off the water surface. And the graph here shows a wavelength spectrum. They're typically attracted to the shorter wavelengths, which in that 400 to kind of 550, 580 range. And they have an aversion to the longer wavelengths. They can see all white and they're attracted to all light, but they have less of an attractant to those higher nanometer ranges from like 580 up to 700. So next slide. So what are some of the issues that hinder this behavior? Research has documented significant reduction in sea turtle nesting activity on beaches illuminated with artificial lights. During the 2007 to 2010 sea turtle nesting seasons, turtle hatchlings that were documented as being disoriented range from 44,000 to more than 64,000 hatchlings per year. Exterior and interior lighting associated with condominiums had the greatest impact, causing approximately 40% of the documented hatchling disorientation and misorientations. Other causes included urban sky glow and street lights. And some of this, the problematic lighting is unshielded light sources where you can directly see that light source, or a high mounted fixture, because even with a good fixture with an amber LED or good shielding, the higher mounted it is, the higher likelihood that it could be directly or indirectly visible from the beach. Excessive lighting, overlighting an area more than what's required for human safety standards, uplighting, lots of short wavelength light sources. Picture shows here some of the difficulties where you do have a relatively dark area right behind the dunes, but more of those inland lights are visible. Sky glow is a big issue across the state, particularly in Southeast Florida. So next slide. So impacts on nesting and emerging sea turtles. Sea turtles need a clean, dark beach to emerge from the water to lay their eggs, and hatchlings to emerge, and for each of them to make it to the water quickly and safely. Threats to nesting and emerging sea turtles on the beach include coastal development, hurricanes, erosion, loss or degrading of habitat, increased human presence on the beach. There are lots of programs currently in place at the local, state level to remove as much trash as possible, get beach furniture off the beach, and limit human disturbances at night. Construction projects on and near the nesting beach can be conditioned to have work occur outside of nesting season to limit impact, or a project near the beach can limit work to daylight only hours during nesting season. That poses some difficulties because a lot of times that's the easiest time to complete some of these projects. Temporary and permanent artificial beachfront lighting may cause disorientations or misorientations of sea turtle hatchlings. Visual signs are the primary sea finding mechanism for hatchlings, and the emergence from the nest and crawl to the sea is one of the most critical periods of a sea turtle's life. Hatchlings have a very limited energy supply to make it one to the water and then another several miles offshore to the safety of those sargassum lines. The ones that do not make it to the sea quickly become food for predators on the beach, ghost crabs, birds, raccoons. They could get trapped in the uplands. We see them in storm drains. They get run over by vehicles, or they kind of exhaust their energy supply or become dehydrated and never reach the sea at all. Some types of beachfront lighting attracting hatchlings away from the sea, while some lights cause adult turtles to avoid stretches of bright illuminated beaches. Females nest multiple times in a season and need to lay their eggs to prepare for the next clutch is coming, because they can unload multiple clutches or multiple nest attempts in a season. And if that female is not able to lay her egg, she may have to kind of dump that clutch into the ocean, and then they're not viable. And if the nest site has been disturbed or destroyed, females may nest in inferior locations where hatchlings are less likely to survive or may not even lay the eggs at all. Next slide. So there are some solutions to limit the amount of lighting. We, in addition to regular construction conditions, limiting work to outside of season, or to doing daylight hours only, limit as much of that work as possible. And even being aware that even bridge projects, even though they're not necessarily on a beach, they can still be visible from the beach. But there's some solutions for the permanent lighting as well as for temporary construction lighting as well. Part of this includes lower mounting heights, lower lumen output, shielded or directed light sources, and approved long wavelengths. And they can be difficult with some of the projects you're dealing with, because you're lighting a huge area, and there's obviously human safety concerns and lighting requirements that you have to meet. So there's some wiggle room where we try to work with you as much as possible, where we would prefer the light to be much lower, but obviously if it has to be a certain height for minimum clearance standards, we can work with that. But we just want it to meet all those human safety standards, and then at the minimum level possible where you're still limiting that impact on the nesting beach. So lumen output is limiting that light source and the total lumen output as much as possible, so you can still meet the desired light levels that you're aiming for. In addition to providing shielding options, as well as various shielding options, because depending on the position of the light, if it's on the landward side of the road, you may need a shielding on one side, where if that light's on the opposite or seaward side of the road, you may need a different position light, or like a shoebox style 4-sided light or 3-sided light, or angle, as well as like different depths of that shield. The more options that are available, the more like flexibility we have when on different installations. And as far as the quantity of lights, the old adage was, as few lights as possible. But if you have to increase the number of lights, but they can be all mounted lower, or they're in a better position, then that may be necessary to achieve like better results and less impact. And then long wavelengths as well, and we'll get into that on the next slide. So this is kind of wrap up long wavelengths. This is work that we've worked a lot with DOT and other manufacturers to have the best possible way of approving these. FWC has a certification program, and they partner with FDOT to try to identify some of these lights When we see them proposed for fixtures, what we're looking for is a narrowband amber LED, where it's absent those portions of the wavelength below 560 nanometers and has a significant portion, it's like 98% of the light is above 560 nanometers. And the two graphs on the right kind of show the difference between the one at the bottom right is an acceptable amber and narrowband where it's above 560 and doesn't have any of those portions of the wavelength below 560. The one in the top right is a PC amber. So it'll still be listed as an amber, so it's a little confusing, but that PC amber, which is that phosphor converted amber, is part of the issue. Even though it looks like an amber light, you can see from that graph, there's still portions of that wavelength below 560 nanometers, and that's where it's most attractant to a marine turtle. And there's kind of a misconception, I touched on it earlier, that amber LEDs are invisible to turtles. So if you just have an amber LED, you don't have to worry about anything else, but that's not accurate. They still have an attraction to it. It's just less of an attractant to a fixture with short wavelength light. So in combination of lower mounting, lower lumen, shielded, and the amber, it should minimize that impact. A lot of engineers will ask, what color temperature can I use? It's difficult because they don't have a lot of readings for color temperatures below 2700 Kelvin, which is typically a narrowband amber LED is probably going to be less than it's going to be around 2200 Kelvin or less. But it's difficult to approve a color temperature because it doesn't necessarily show us the makeup of the light. So the important thing for us is to see a spectral distribution graph similar to the two on the right, so we can identify that wavelength quickly, whether it's an acceptable one or not. And typically that's done either testing with a spectrometer, or some lighting manufacturers do third-party testing with a LM79 or LM80 report. You just want to make sure that that includes that spectral distribution graph, similar to the picture on the left, which shows a portion of a graph or a portion of an LM79 report that shows that spectral distribution graph. Some of the difficulties with construction lighting, temporary lighting, is it's difficult to find amber LEDs, and we understand that. It's something we're working with manufacturers, try to develop as many as possible. Some of them have readily available ones with filters and to get a color. And those are difficult to use just because many filters that I've tested and looked at, they make the color appear to be an amber color, but they don't necessarily change the makeup of the wavelength. So there's still that short wavelength light present, similar to that PC amber. So it's still going to be attractant. So some of those, like temporary construction lights, some of the most important things is positioning, where you're kind of angled down as much as you can and angled away from that beach. So you're lighting your work area where that light is needed for human safety, but you're minimizing that light spread and that impact to the nesting beach, either directly behind the construction or even north, south, east, or west, where it still could be visible from the beach. So that's all I have.
Thanks, Luke. We'll transition over to Dave to talk about sea turtles from the NOAA perspective, and then we'll do the Q&A for the sea turtles when Dave is done.
I'll try to make this a little snappy. So I'm going to talk about sea turtles when they're in the water from NOAA fisheries perspective. We just heard in Florida, we consult on 5 species of sea turtles. That'd be loggerhead green, Kemp's Ridley, hawksbill, and leatherback. So in the Gulf of Mexico, FDOT projects would primarily affect loggerhead green and Kemp's Ridley sea turtles. In the Atlantic, might have some involvement with hawksbill sea turtles if the project occurs near hard bottom or reef habitats like you find in the Keys. The leatherback sea turtle is really a deep water pelagic species, and it doesn't come to the coast very often, so you're not likely to have an FDOT project affect that. So I'll just kind of go quickly through some life history stuff now. So loggerheads are the most abundant species of sea turtle found in U.S. coastal waters. They're found worldwide, but all the individuals that you find in Florida would be from what's called the Northwest Atlantic distinct population segment. And so that term it's also referred to as a DPS. That term means that that population of turtles is considered to be separate from other loggerhead populations for geographic, ecological, or genetic reasons. So you find loggerheads inshore and nearshore waters less than 200 meters deep. You find juvenile and adults in those areas, essentially along all shelf waters of the Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic, including within sounds, bays, and estuaries. The oceanic juveniles reside in the northeast Atlantic waters in the Gulf of Mexico, and post-hatchlings are found in sargassum seaweed habitats, floating seaweed habitats, drift lines, and other convergence zones. So those are basically areas where ocean currents cause natural and man-made floating materials to be concentrated together in a particular area. And that's for all the hard-shelled species, you're going to find that that's an important habitat for the post-hatchlings. So loggerheads can weigh up to 250 pounds, get up to 3 feet in length. As far as their diet goes, they eat things like hard-shelled prey like whelk, conch, and mollusks, although they will eat other items. And the post-hatchlings feed on small invertebrates that they find in the sargassum communities they inhabit in other driftline convergence zone habitats. The adult females nest from April to September, generally like 3 to 5 nests in a season. And the loggerhead population for the Northwest Atlantic DPS is generally considered stable at this point, although there are threats to it, so that can always change. There is critical habitat designated for loggerheads. There's 38 units of that designated among 5 categories: nearshore reproductive habitat, winter areas, breeding habitat, constricted migratory corridors, and sargassum habitats. In general, FDOT projects are not real likely to affect loggerhead critical, when in terms of water ratings, critical habitat, because they're all somewhat offshore of the coastline. So that's just a picture of the loggerhead critical habitat in the different categories that you find. Okay, moving on to green sea turtles. They are found worldwide, and they could be from either the North Atlantic or the South Atlantic DPS units. Both of them occur in Florida waters. In the U.S. Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico inshore and nearshore waters, you find juvenile and adult green sea turtles from Texas to Massachusetts, also the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. Oceanic juveniles are found in offshore waters of the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico. Post-hatchlings, again, you find it in sargassum habitats, drift lines, and other convergence zones, and that's really true of all post-hatchlings for all the hard-shelled sea turtle species that we have in Florida anyways. The 2 different DPS regions, they were designated based upon nesting beaches, but individuals from the South Atlantic and North Atlantic DPS units overlap in regards to their foraging grounds. So that's why you have both DPS units in Florida. Green turtles can get up to 350 pounds, get over 3 feet in length. Green turtles are unique among the sea turtles in that they are herbivorous, so they feed mostly on seagrass and algae. The post-hatchlings feed on algae and small invertebrates in seagrass or sargassum communities and other convergence zone habitats. The adult females nest in the summer between June and September, peak nesting in June and July, and they lay about 5 nests in a season. So both the North Atlantic and South Atlantic DPS units are large, especially the North Atlantic unit. And most of the major nesting grounds for both DPSs show stable to increasing nesting trends at this point. And in Florida, green sea turtle nesting has been regularly breaking records for number of nests in the state over the past few years. There is critical habitat designated, but it's in Puerto Rico, so you don't have to worry about that in terms of FDOT projects. Okay, now going to the Kemp's Ridley. So adult and juvenile Kemp's Ridley sea turtles found primarily in inshore and nearshore coastal waters of the Gulf of Mexico and Western Atlantic, as well as in sounds, bays, and estuaries. The oceanic juveniles are found in offshore waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the Western Atlantic until they get to be about two years old, and then they recruit to inshore and nearshore habitats. Like the other hard-shelled species, the post-hatchlings are found in sargassum habitats, drift lines, and other convergence zones. So that's just a map that shows the overall approximate range of Kemp's Ridley. So you see they're pretty much in the Gulf of Mexico and all the way up the Atlantic coast. So the Kemp's Ridleys are the smallest of the sea turtles. They only get up to about 100 pounds and a length of up to 28 inches. The adult and nearshore juveniles forage mostly on crabs, but they'll also eat mollusks, snails, jellyfish, and other food they find. Post-hatchlings feed on, once again, small invertebrates in the sargassum community and other driftline and convergence zone habitats. Females nest from May to July, with primary nesting occurring in Mexico mostly. And there is a secondary, much smaller nesting site in Texas on Padre Island. And they typically lay 2 to 3 nests in a season. So there's no critical habitat designated for Kemp's Ridleys at this point, so you don't have to worry about that one. So nesting has actually increased dramatically from a near population crash in the 1970s, but since it's sort of recovered from that period, it's gone up and down. In 2010, there was a large drop. There was increases in 2011, 2012, then there were more decreases in 2013, 2014, increases in 2016 and 2017, but then it's declined again in 2018 and 2019. So it's kind of been, they're not as bad as they were in the 70s, but it's been up and down since they've somewhat recovered. Okay, now we'll move on to hawksbills. So the adults and juveniles can be found in inshore and nearshore coastal waters of the Gulf of Mexico and Western Atlantic, also found in sounds, bays, and estuaries. However, within U.S. waters, they are primarily found at or near coral reef and other reef habitats in the Caribbean and Florida, and are rare visitors to any other habitat areas. And there's a reason for that I'll discuss in a second in terms of diet. As with other hard-shelled species, the host or post-hatchlings and pelagic juveniles can be found in sargassum habitats, driftlines, and other convergence zones. Hawksbill adults can get up to 150 pounds and up to 35 inches in length. The adults and the nearshore juveniles feed mostly on sponges. So as you see, all these, as adults and nearshore juveniles, all these different species have slightly different feeding niches that they, so they eat somewhat different things, although there's some overlap. So they eat mostly sponges. So that's why you find them on hard bottom and reef areas, because that's where sponges grow. They'll also eat some invertebrates and algae. The post-hatchlings and the oceanic juveniles feed on small vertebrates and algae within sargassum communities and driftline convergence zone habitats. Nesting within the Western Atlantic primarily occurs in the Caribbean and South America. Nesting on the U.S. mainland is pretty rare and sporadic. The females nest from April to November with local variations within that time frame, and they typically lay 2 to 3 nests in a season. So the hawksbill population status is pretty variable, but most of the populations that contribute to hawksbills in the U.S. waters appear to be stable at the moment. They do have critical habitat designated, but once again, it's in Puerto Rico, so there's not going to be any involvement with any FDOT projects for that. Okay, and finally, talk about the Atlantic leatherback sea turtle. So this is a unique sea turtle in that it doesn't have a hard shell. It has this tough leathery shell, which is of course why they're called leatherbacks. Unlike the other hard-shelled species, the leatherbacks occupy the oceanic habitat throughout all their life stages, except when they have to come inshore for mating and nesting, or when they're following jellyfish blooms into nearshore coastal areas to feed. And other than that, they're very rarely found in inshore waters. They are the largest of all sea turtles. They can get up to 2,000 pounds and get over 6.5 feet long. They feed primarily on soft-bodied animals like jellyfish and salps. So nesting in the Western Atlantic is primarily in the Caribbean, Central America, East Coast of Florida, and South America. And other than the East Coast of Florida, nesting on the U.S. mainland is very rare and sporadic. They tend to nest earlier than the other species. Like Lucas was just saying, they can go as early as February, but typically it goes from March and runs through July, and they can lay up to 5 to 7 nests in a season. In the Western Atlantic, major nesting populations have mostly been increasing or stable, but in recent years, they seem like they're maybe declining somewhat. Nesting along eastern Florida is still relatively minor in terms of its contribution to the population overall, but it has been increasing rapidly. They also have critical habitat designated, but it's in the U.S. Virgin Islands in St. Croix, so you don't have to worry about FDOT projects in terms of that. And now I'm going to go into some of the threats that the sea turtles face. And when you're talking about the threats, you have to think about what species you're talking about and also what life stage, because the different life stages are found in different locations. And so they may have different threats to deal with. So in this first table, FDOT projects could involve shoreline stabilization with issues due to construction activities, creation of physical barriers, alteration of nearshore currents, or concentration of predators. Probably not so much for the beach renourishment end of things. Bridge projects can involve dredging with adverse effects like increased turbidity, habitat alterations, noise and disturbance, or direct interactions with the dredging equipment. FDOT projects sometimes involve fishing piers, can have adverse effects due to construction and maintenance of the facility, but also incidental take. Once the fishing pier is up and operational and fishing is occurring because people are putting bait in the water, that can attract sea turtles and they can be accidentally hooked because of that. FDOT projects also involve construction of water control structures sometimes, which can have potential adverse effects. Bridge projects usually involve pile driving activities, and that can produce adverse effects such as pile driving noise and construction vessel conflicts with sea turtles. So while this is not an FDOT really related thing, one of the main threats to sea turtles is accidental capture and fishing nets, particularly shrimp trawls, where they will get into the net and they'll drown because they can't get to the surface. This accidental capture is also known as incidental take. So as a take reduction measure, shrimp trawlers in the US are now required to have turtle excluder devices, which are also known as TEDs, installed inside the net to allow turtles to escape. And in this illustration, the TEDs are the little yellow things that are inside the net. So TEDs have a set of bars inside the net that allow shrimp to pass through to the bottom of the net, but they basically catch the sea turtles before they get into the bottom of the net. And where the bars are, there's an opening inside of the net. So basically, the turtle kind of shoots out the side at that point in the net where the hole is, and it allows the sea turtle to escape. The turtle can then swim to the surface and breathe, and it doesn't drown. So that's one of those ideas of take reduction measures. This is particular one is for the shrimp fishery. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. And we got, I think, a couple minutes for questions.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate you guys making it through that presentation. We do have a couple of questions, and maybe we'll start with the questions for Luke first. I think you might have addressed this to some degree, but we'll just make sure that we fully answer the question from the audience. Do the hatchlings get disoriented? Do they usually get rescued?
Sometimes, not all of them get rescued. There is, I mentioned the network of Florida Marine Turtle permit holders that FWC permits and kind of manages. Those network of volunteers will sometimes go out and do nighttime surveys of the areas to identify hatchlings in areas that they know that has really high disorientation rates, particularly in South Florida. I know in Broward County, there's organizations that will go out and have nighttime hours available. So if someone calls a hotline, they can go quickly get those hatchlings because those have to be put in the water immediately, and only those that are authorized can do that. There are a lot of them that unfortunately don't make it to the water, or those are the ones that usually find their way into a roadway or drainage, or get run over, or they're so small they're really hard to find. But if any of the public sees them, there's FWC has a hotline number that they can call, so someone can get out there usually as quickly as possible. So we try to, as much as we can, rescue them, but unfortunately, a lot of them don't get rescued.
Thank you, Luke. Another question for you is about Hurricane Michael. Did Hurricane Michael have any known impact on sea turtle nesting in the Panhandle?
Yes, it did. Hurricanes in general have a pretty good impact on nesting, depending on when they occur. Even ones that don't make landfall, or the ones kind of stirring in the Gulf or in the Atlantic. If it's during like July, August, where there's hatchlings that have already emerged from a nest and made it to that sargassum line that's offshore. Sometimes those storm events, either a named storm or tropical storms, they're stirring, they can kind of push that rack line inland a little bit. So sometimes that rack line, which you'll probably see on the news, there's a bunch of seaweed on the beaches. That rack line has those hatchlings in it, and they're called washbacks or post hatchlings. Sometimes they get pushed onto shore, so that's one impact that hurricanes can have. And Michael had to a certain extent. You get a lot of those washbacks and post hatchlings in like St. John's, Volusia, and Brevard counties. And there's teams of volunteers that go out and do post hatchling surveys for those rack lines to identify those species, and then they take them to rehab so they can wait until the storm passes and they can drop them off offshore. But I know Michael destroyed some active nests that were there. Pretty much most of the ones, when you have that much water on the beach, there's overwash of a nest, and if water's over the top of it, it's likely that all the eggs are not viable anymore. So in a big event like that, where there's a lot of storm surge, you pretty much have like 100% loss of nests that are in the sand. And then any erosion and debris will prevent some, depending on what time of the year, could prevent some other females from coming up to nest in that area, particularly if it's like earlier in the season. So some of those more devastating, like hurricanes, are the ones that are where you still have some nesting that's occurring and you have a lot of nest in the sand. So that's a pretty big impact on both sides of the nesting activity. So yes, Michael did have a lot of impact on nesting, and some of those are pretty low density areas in the Panhandle and like St. George Island, Port St. Joe. So, they may have only had like 10 or 15 nests. So, but that's like 100% loss of nesting activity in those areas.
And maybe one other, it was just towards the end of the nesting season too, thought maybe, I don't know, at least a little bit of a silver lining perhaps, but.
Yeah, and that's one of the difficulties storms have, is because those permit holders go out every day to mark the nest, and that's needed for some construction projects to occur because some of the conditions are avoiding marked nest on the beach or avoiding by 10 or 20 feet a marked nest. So when those storm events happen, they wipe out all the stakes that were there. So depending on how much water or washout occurred, it's difficult to remark those nests unless you have really good GPS location to remark those, or for events to occur or construction events to occur. But any storm event, because the permit holders can't get out there and mark new nest, there's always that chance of an unmarked nest. So sometimes, like if there's debris collection, it has to be regulated and conditioned appropriately to avoid some of those impacts.
Right.
I'll add that one of the disaster after the storm is what we continue to deal with, and nest areas are being affected because of the really enthusiastic approach to restore areas that were affected by the storm. So we're having to be vigilant that those areas along the shore, traditional nesting areas, aren't be affected by hardening, and that's usually, well, that's still happening a couple of years later.
Right. Yeah. Maybe one more question. I think it was really great to have Luke and Dave kind of tag team to kind of reemphasize the fact that, right, they split jurisdiction for the species. And I wanted to tie that back into some of the stuff that Mark actually talked about earlier with regard to our minor activities programmatic. And so just to kind of say that only Fish and Wildlife Service and sea turtle interactions are addressed in that programmatic agreement. National Marine Fisheries swimming sea turtles are not addressed there. And so I think this question will help kind of bring some of that all together a little bit. But how do U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, oh, I'm sorry, it says FWC. I was just anticipating it saying National Marine Fisheries Service, but how do Fish and Wildlife Service and FWC work together on projects that may impact a sea turtle beach? So Luke, I think that would be for you as well, if you would like to try to.
Probably the biggest example would be beach nourishment projects that we work collectively on. We have a statewide programmatic biological opinion for beach nourishment activities that in the development of that, we had coordination with FWC. I mean, I know firsthand because I work for FWC and for the service, so I know the coordination on both sides. So a lot of those, it's we work closely together in coordinating them, making sure that everything's covered, that all the conditions are accurate, because FWC will coordinate through usually the DEP permitting system, and the service will coordinate through the Corps permitting system, and there's a little bit of overlap with the Corps and DEP. So we will always be talk with FWC to make sure, you know, if something they don't understand, if there's not coverage, but there's a lot of work in between and a lot of overlap because of the interaction with the permit holders and some of those conditions for the work.
Great. Thanks. Well, I know we're over time, so maybe we'll go ahead and let Mark just wrap us up and talk about what we're going to be, give us a quick overview for what we're going to talk about next week. Thanks, Luke. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, thank you guys, and thank you all for sticking around. This has really been a lot of information really quick, but I hope you've enjoyed the presentations. We had good information and species highlights, ending up learning a whole lot about snail kites from Vicky and manta rays from Calusa, and then sea turtles. Luke and Dave did a great job with those. So thank you all for paying attention there. Really great questions. And if we didn't get to your question yet, or if you have additional questions that you think about later, go ahead and bring those up. Email them to Katasha if it's after the presentation, and she'll gather those, and we can try to get those answered either back to you directly or at the beginning of next week's presentation. So with that, next week, here's the teaser. A lot of good things coming up. If you think this was exciting, we have more species highlights next week. If you have not already registered, please make plans to attend next week. Same time, same day of the week, next Tuesday morning, and we're going to dig a little deeper on some of the laws listing, give you some updates, and talk to you about, again, species, bald eagles, give you some updates there. If you're in Florida, you all have probably encountered bald eagle in your project planning. And so Uganda and Reese will talk to you about that. Bonneted bats in South Florida. We'll hear some exciting stuff from Sandra. And then Nassau grouper with Curtis, and Kevin will be coming in to talk about eastern black rail. So those are exciting species highlights. And then Jeremy Phillips, our director for Florida, will talk about the National Wildlife Refuge System and how you may plan around the refuge system, and you get to highlight some important things there. And then for all of you who have had piles to drive, Dave's going to talk to you about a new calculator to estimate potential effects there. So a lot of exciting things to stay tuned for next week. Please register if you haven't already. If you have additional questions, get those to us, and we'll talk to you about it. But a lot of questions have been coming in already. Deepwater Horizon oil spill, saw that question there, and I'll mention that is now 11 years ago, as I recall it, 11 years ago. And yes, there were effects across the coastline to both sea turtles and a number of other resources, and the trustees are working to overcome those, and a lot of good information we can provide. We'll try to link you up there to get information about that tremendous and devastating oil spill that affected the entire Gulf, and especially the Flowers Bank there. So because it was very close to the wellhead. With that, we will try to answer those questions, keep them coming in whatever manner, and plan to stay around next Tuesday, and we'll get you some more information. With that, I think I'll go ahead and wrap it up, because we've kept you a long time, giving you a lot to look at. But think about using those programmatic agreements and use all the good information we provided here on these species. Thank you very much.